The fifth sphere. Expansion had brought glory to the Tau Empire, yet even in the midst of triumph, there were those who saw further horizons yet to conquer. In the great council chambers of Tau, where the wisdom of the ethereal caste guided the destiny of worlds, Poroshais stood before the assembled leaders with the confidence of one who believed she held the key to the next great leap forward for the greater good. The chamber gleamed with the soft blue light of holographic displays showing the extent of Tau expansion across the galaxy. Each point of light represented a world brought into the embrace of the greater good, a testament to the superiority of Tau science and diplomacy over the barbarism that plagued the rest of the galaxy. Yet for Shais, these victories were but stepping stones to something far grander. Her voice carried the measured cadence of the water caste when she spoke, each word chosen not merely for meaning but for impact. Honored ethereals, we have proven our mastery over matter and energy. We have shown that rational thought and technological advancement can overcome any obstacle. Yet there remains one frontier that we have approached with uncharacteristic caution. Arno Tau Akaya Vedenta, first among ethereals, regarded her with eyes that had seen the rise of the fifth sphere. His presence commanded absolute attention, the very air seeming to still when he focused his gaze. Speak freely, Poro. The council would hear your thoughts. Shais felt the familiar surge of purpose that drove all her kind when given opportunity to serve the greater good. The warp, honored ones. The realm that the primitive Gellar speak of with such terror and superstition. They approach it with rituals and mysticism, handicapped by their inability to see truth through the veil of their own ignorance. The memory of her first encounter with Imperial survivors rose unbidden in her mind. 3 years ago, during the liberation of Dalith Sept's outer colonies, she had been tasked with interrogating captured Gellar soldiers. They had spoken of the warp not as a natural phenomenon to be studied and mastered, but as some malevolent entity to be feared. Their words had been filled with references to demons and possession, to ships that entered the Imperium and emerged changed in ways that defied rational explanation. She had felt nothing but disgust at their primitive worldview. Where they saw supernatural horror, she saw only another challenge for Tau Science to overcome. The Gellar failed because they approached the warp with fear rather than understanding, with superstition rather than analysis. They were trapped by their own limitations, unable to see that what they called demons were simply life forms adapted to an environment they did not comprehend. The Gellar speak of this realm as if it were alive, she continued, her tone carrying the subtle disdain that marked her caste when dealing with inferior thinking. They claim it is inhabited by entities that seek to corrupt and destroy. Yet when pressed for specifics, they can provide only rambling accounts of nightmares and hallucinations. Clearly, their crude understanding of dimensional physics has led them to misinterpret natural phenomena as supernatural threats. On Shi, eldest of the assembled ethereals, leaned forward slightly. His voice carried the weight of millennia when he spoke. You propose to test this theory, Poroshais. Not merely to test it, honored Aun Shi, but to demonstrate the superiority of the Tau approach to the entire galaxy. Shais gestured to the holographic displays surrounding them. Our current warp-skimming technology serves us well for expansion within our sphere of influence. But imagine the possibilities if we could master true deep warp travel. The Imperium's size comes not from their superiority, but from their willingness to brave dangers we have been too cautious to challenge. She paused, allowing the implications to settle in the minds of the Council. I propose a demonstration mission. A single vessel, equipped with modified ether, drives capable of deep warp penetration, staffed by volunteers from the Caste Diplomatic Corps. We will enter the deep Imperium, conduct scientific observations of the phenomena the Gellar claim to fear, and return with proof that rational TOE methodology can succeed where imperial superstition has failed. The silence that followed was heavy with contemplation. Finally, Ornel Monteca, youngest of the ethereals present, spoke. "Such a mission carries risks, Poro. The ether drives were designed for shallow translation, specifically to avoid the deeper currents of the warp." Shires had anticipated this concern. With respect, honored Ornel, those safety protocols were established based on Gellar accounts of warp phenomena. We designed our technology around their limitations rather than exploring our own capabilities. I have been working with Earth-Caste engineers to develop modifications that will allow controlled deep warp entry while maintaining the rational, scientific approach that defines our superiority. She activated her personal display projector, showing schematics of the experimental vessel that had been under construction in the orbital shipyards of TOE. The vessel Caste Edge has been equipped with enhanced sensor arrays and recording equipment. Every moment of the mission will be documented, every phenomenon analyzed and categorized. When we return, we will possess the first truly scientific analysis of deep warp conditions ever compiled. The ship gleamed in the holographic display, its sleek lines embodying the pinnacle of TOE engineering. Unlike the crude, Baroque vessels favored by the Imperium, the Caste Edge had been designed with purpose and efficiency in mind. Its hull incorporated the latest advances in composite materials, while its modified ether drives represented theoretical breakthroughs that would have been impossible without the collaborative genius of multiple castes working toward the greater good. Pauvre Caste, the Earth Caste engineer, who had overseen the modifications, stood ready to provide technical details if requested. Beside him, several members of Shire's research team waited with barely contained enthusiasm for the opportunity to expand the boundaries of TOE knowledge. They had volunteered for the mission not out of reckless bravado, but out of absolute confidence in the superiority of TOE methodology over primitive imperial approaches. Onoto Akayavadenta studied the schematics with the careful attention that had made him first among ethereals. When he spoke, his words carried the finality of absolute authority. "Your confidence honors the water caste, Poroshais. Yet confidence without wisdom leads to the same failures that plague our enemies. Honored Arno, I propose this mission not from mere confidence, but from the logical extension of everything the TOE Empire represents," Shais replied, her voice carrying the passion that drove her caste in their negotiations. "We have proven that rational thought can overcome every challenge this galaxy has presented. Our technology surpasses that of species far older than ours. Our society has achieved unity, where others know only conflict. The warp is simply the next frontier to be conquered through the application of greater good principles." The debate that followed stretched through the cycles of TOE's rotation, as each ethereal weighed the potential benefits against the theoretical risks. Yet throughout the discussion, Shais felt the growing certainty that her proposal would be approved. The logic was undeniable. The TOE Empire had succeeded by refusing to accept the limitations that confined lesser species. To abandon that approach now would be to embrace the very stagnation that had doomed the Imperium to 10 millennia of decline. When the final vote was taken, the approval came with conditions that Shais accepted gladly. The mission would proceed, but with additional safety protocols and communication requirements that demonstrated the ethereal's wisdom in balancing ambition with prudence. The Caste Edge would maintain constant contact with TOE Command, transmitting all sensor data in real time to allow the finest minds of the Empire to analyze every discovery. In the days that followed the Council's decision, Shaez threw herself into the final preparations with the dedication that marked her caste. The crew was selected from among the most experienced water caste diplomats and earth caste engineers, each one carefully chosen for their expertise and their unwavering commitment to the greater good. The ship itself underwent final systems checks and modifications, every component tested and retested to ensure perfect functionality. Yet it was not the technical preparations that brought Shaez the greatest satisfaction, but the knowledge that her mission would serve as a beacon for the entire galaxy. When the Kaoyon's Edge returned from the deep warp with scientific proof of Tau mastery over the realm that terrified the Imperium, it would mark the beginning of a new age. No longer would the Tau be confined to the edges of galactic civilization. They would take their rightful place as the guiding force that would bring order and progress to a galaxy trapped in superstition and decay. The night before departure, Shaez stood in her quarters aboard the Kaoyon's Edge, composing her final transmission to all Tau worlds. Her words would be carried across the Empire, from the industrial worlds of the Dalith Sept to the military bases of the Viola Sept, ensuring that every citizen of the greater good would understand the significance of what was about to unfold. "Citizens of the Tau Empire," she began, her voice carrying the confidence that had marked her entire career in the water caste. "Tomorrow we embark upon a mission that will demonstrate once and for all the superiority of rational thought over primitive superstition. The Gellar speak of the warp as a realm of terror and madness, yet they approach it with the same backwards thinking that has kept their society mired in stagnation for 10 millennia. We will show them, and the galaxy, that there is no frontier that cannot be conquered through the application of greater good principles and Tau ingenuity." The message concluded with her personal seal and the motto that had driven the Fifth Sphere expansion: progress through unity, strength through knowledge. Soon those words would take on new meaning as the Tau Empire proved that even the realm beyond real space could be mastered through the patient application of scientific methodology. As Tau's star set beyond the orbital platforms where the Kaoyon's Edge waited for departure, Shaez felt only anticipation for the triumph that awaited. The primitive fears that had haunted lesser species for millennia were about to be dispelled by the light of Tau understanding. The galaxy would remember this moment, not as the beginning of tragedy, but as the dawn of true enlightenment. The orbital shipyards of Tau hummed with the constant activity of construction and innovation, yet in the secured bay, where the Kaoyon's Edge underwent its final modifications, a different kind of work was taking place. Here, the careful balance of safety and efficiency that defined Tau technology was being deliberately altered in service of a greater understanding. Pauvre Kaoyon stood before the exposed ether drive assembly, his practiced eye tracing the elegant curves of the gravitic field generators that had made Tau expansion possible. For 3 centuries, these drives had carried the forces of the greater good across the void through a method that was both ingenious and cautious. Unlike the brutal warp engines of the Imperium, which tore holes in reality through brute force and primitive mysticism, the ether drives achieved translation through precise manipulation of dimensional barriers. The engineer's voice carried the quiet pride of his caste when he explained the principles to the assembled team. The standard ether drive operates on a principle of controlled oscillation between real space and the upper layers of the immaterium. We never fully translate into the warp itself, but rather skim along its surface, like a stone across water. This allows us to achieve faster-than-light travel while avoiding the deeper currents that the Gellar claim are so dangerous. Shaez listened with the attention her diplomatic training had instilled, yet her focus was not on the beauty of existing technology, but on its limitations. Show me the safety protocols, Porvre. I need to understand exactly what prevents us from achieving deeper penetration. Kauyon activated a series of holographic displays showing the intricate web of safeguards built into every ether drive. The primary limitation is the automatic extraction system, he explained, highlighting a complex array of sensors and control circuits. The moment the drive detects any anomalous readings consistent with deep warp phenomena, it immediately initiates emergency translation back to real space. Additionally, the gravitational field generators are calibrated to prevent the formation of stable warp rifts that might allow deeper entity manifestation. The Caste Diplomat studied the schematics with the same intensity she had once brought to negotiations with stubborn planetary governors. Every safeguard represented not prudent engineering, but unnecessary fear based on Gellar superstitions that had infected even Toe thinking. These protocols assume that deep warp contact is inherently dangerous, she observed. Yet that assumption is based on Imperial accounts rather than direct Toe observation. Kauyon's expression showed the first hint of unease. His engineering training had taught him to trust in the wisdom of established safety margins, yet he could not deny the logic of Shias's argument. The protocols were established during our early encounters with Imperial refugees, honored Poro. Their accounts of warp phenomena suggested extreme caution was warranted. Exactly my point, Shias replied, her voice carrying the conviction that had made her one of the most effective negotiators in the Caste. We allowed primitive Gellar fears to constrain our technological development. We built limitations into our own capabilities based on the failures of an inferior species. The time has come to test whether those limitations serve any purpose beyond perpetuating ignorance. The process of removing the safety protocols took 3 rotations of careful work. Each safeguard that was disabled represented another step toward true understanding. Yet Kauyon found himself growing more troubled with every modification. The automatic extraction system had been designed by the finest minds of the Earth Caste, its algorithms refined through centuries of experience with warp skimming technology. To simply bypass it seemed not bold, but reckless. Poro shies, he said, during the second day of modifications. Perhaps we should consider a graduated approach. We could modify the protocols to allow deeper penetration while maintaining some emergency safeguards. Shias paused in her examination of the gravitational field generator calibrations. Her response carried the patient tone she used when explaining complex concepts to less sophisticated species. Porvre Kauyon, your concern does you credit, yet consider the implications of what you suggest. If we approach the deep warp with the assumption that it is dangerous, we contaminate our observations with fear-based preconceptions. To achieve true understanding, we must approach it as we would any other natural phenomenon, with scientific objectivity rather than superstitious dread. The engineers' unease deepened as they proceeded to install the enhanced sensor arrays that would monitor warp phenomena during the deep translation. These devices represented the cutting edge of Teo science, capable of detecting and analyzing energy patterns across the entire electromagnetic spectrum and beyond. Yet their very sophistication highlighted the magnitude of what they were attempting to study. The sensor data will provide invaluable insights into the true nature of the Imperium, Shias explained, as the final arrays were calibrated. For the first time, we will have rational, scientific measurements of deep warp conditions rather than the fevered ravings of Gellar survivors. When we return, the data we gather will revolutionize our understanding of dimensional physics. The test of the modified drive systems came on the 5th day, conducted in the outer reaches of the Tau system, where any potential anomalies would pose no threat to inhabited worlds. The Kauyon's edge separated from the orbital docking platform with the grace that marked all Tau spacecraft, its hull gleaming in the light of the distant star. Kauyon monitored the drive systems from the engineering station, his instruments showing readings that fluctuated far beyond normal parameters. Without the automatic extraction protocols, the ether drives could maintain translation states that would have triggered immediate emergency procedures under standard operation. The ship rode deeper into the dimensional barriers than any tow vessel had ever gone, yet remained tantalizingly close to full warp translation. "Sensor readings are within expected parameters," reported Paula Shaswi, the junior engineer monitoring the enhanced detection arrays. "No anomalous energy signatures detected. All systems responding normally to modified drive configurations." Shias felt a surge of vindication as the test proceeded flawlessly. The fears that had constrained Tau expansion into deep warp travel were proving to be exactly what she had suspected: primitive superstitions with no basis in scientific reality. The ship penetrated deeper into the dimensional boundaries with each test cycle, yet the sensors detected nothing more threatening than the exotic energy patterns that theoretical models had predicted. "Excellent work, Povrikawion," she said, as the test phase concluded and the ship returned to normal space. "Your modifications have performed beyond even my expectations. The drive systems are ready for operational deep warp translation." Yet the engineer's expression remained troubled, despite the apparent success of the test. "Poro, the readings we obtained show significant gravitational distortions in the deeper dimensional layers. While we detected no immediate threats, the data suggests that prolonged exposure to those conditions could stress even our modified systems." Shias studied the sensor logs with the thoroughness that had made her reputation in the water caste. The gravitational anomalies Kawion mentioned were indeed present in the data, yet they fell well within the parameters her theoretical models had predicted. "The distortions you note are consistent with the natural properties of compressed space-time in the deep Imperium," she explained. "They represent no more danger than the radiation fields around a pulsar, hazardous only to those who approach without proper preparation and understanding." That evening, alone in her quarters aboard the Kawion's Edge, Shias updated her mission journal with the satisfaction of one whose theories were being vindicated by observation. Her words would serve as a record of this historic moment when the Tau Empire finally cast off the limitations imposed by primitive thinking. "The modifications to the ether drive systems have exceeded all expectations," she dictated to the recording device. "Today's test demonstrated conclusively that deep warp translation is not only possible, but entirely manageable when approached with proper Tau methodology. The fears that have kept us confined to shallow translation protocols have proven baseless. Nothing more than superstitions inherited from the failed Imperial approach to warp travel." She paused, considering the broader implications of what they had achieved. The Gellar speak of the warp as if it were a living entity possessed of malevolent intelligence. Their accounts describe phenomena that contradict known physical laws: ships that emerge from warp travel aged by centuries in mere hours, crews driven mad by exposure to demonic entities, vessels that return changed in ways that defy rational explanation. Yet their own crude technology provides a complete explanation for these supposed mysteries. The analysis continued for nearly an hour as Shias detailed her theories about the true nature of what the Imperials called warp phenomena. Without proper shielding, and with crude, unstable warp drives that created chaotic translation fields, it was hardly surprising that Imperial vessels experienced catastrophic system failures during warp travel. The radiation exposure and gravitational stress from poorly controlled warp rifts would naturally cause both psychological and physiological damage to human crews. What they interpreted as supernatural horror was simply the predictable result of primitive technology attempting to navigate an environment beyond their understanding. "The Tau approach eliminates all of these variables," she concluded. "Our controlled translation methods, enhanced sensor arrays, and rational analytical framework will allow us to study the deep Imperium without the contamination of fear-based preconceptions. When we return from this mission, we will possess the first truly scientific understanding of deep warp conditions ever compiled by any species. The final preparations proceeded with the efficiency that marked all TOW endeavors. The crew conducted systems checks and briefings with methodical precision, each member fully aware of their role in this historic undertaking. Yet among them, Pauvre Kauyon remained quietly troubled by modifications he had helped implement, despite his pride in the technical achievements they represented. As the Kauyon's Edge prepared for departure from TOW Spas, Shais stood on the observation deck, watching the familiar stars that had guided the expansion of the greater good. Soon those same stars would witness the beginning of a new age, an age when the last frontier that had constrained galactic civilization would fall to the inexorable advance of TOW science and reason. The deep warp awaited, not as the realm of horror described in Imperial legends, but as simply another challenge to be overcome through the patient application of superior methodology. The galaxy would soon learn that there was no mystery that could not be solved, no frontier that could not be conquered when approached with the clarity of vision that only the TOW possessed. The moment of translation came with none of the violent upheaval that marked Imperial warp travel, but with the controlled precision that defined all TOW technology. The Kauyon's Edge slipped from real space into the dimensional barriers with graceful efficiency, its modified ether drives generating the complex gravitational fields necessary for deep immaterium penetration. Poro Shais stood on the command bridge, her attention focused on the holographic displays that showed their progress through the dimensional layers. Each meter of penetration took them further than any TOW vessel had ever traveled, yet the ship responded to the modified drive systems with perfect stability. The fears that had constrained TOW expansion for centuries were proving to be exactly what she had theorized, baseless superstitions that had no foundation in scientific reality. Translation depth at 15% beyond standard protocols, reported Paula Chassuy from the navigation console. All systems responding normally. No adverse readings on any monitoring station. The young engineer's voice carried the excitement of one participating in historic achievement, yet Shais noted with satisfaction that her crew maintained the professional discipline that marked the TOW military castes. This was not reckless adventure, but careful scientific exploration conducted with proper methodology and rational analysis. Pauvre Kauyon monitored the drive systems from his engineering station, his instruments displaying readouts that fluctuated far beyond normal operational parameters. Without the automatic extraction protocols, the ether drives could maintain translation states that would have been impossible under standard safety configurations. The gravitational distortions he had worried about during the test phase were present, yet remained within acceptable tolerances. Drive efficiency holding at optimal levels, he reported, though his voice carried an undertone of concern that had grown more pronounced since their departure from TOW space. Gravitational field generators responding normally to deep dimensional stress. Shais moved between the various monitoring stations with the purposeful grace that had served her well in diplomatic negotiations. Every sensor reading, every system status report confirmed what her theoretical models had predicted. The deep immaterium was not the realm of supernatural horror described in Imperial accounts, but simply another environment to be studied and understood through proper scientific method. Translation depth at 25% beyond standard protocols, Chassuy announced, entering uncharted dimensional territory. The words carried weight that resonated through the bridge crew. They were making history with every meter of penetration, pushing back the boundaries of TOW knowledge in service of the greater good. Yet it was in that moment of triumph that the first anomalous readings appeared on the enhanced sensor arrays. "Poro," called Paula Mayen from the sensor station, her voice carrying a note of confusion. "I'm detecting geometric distortions in the surrounding spatial matrix. The readings suggest dimensional curvatures that don't conform to standard gravitational models." Shai studied the sensor displays with the analytical mind that had made her reputation in the water caste. The distortions Mien reported were indeed present in the data. manifesting as impossible angular relationships in the space around the ship, corners that bent in directions that had no names, distances that measured differently depending on the direction of observation. "Fascinating," she murmured, her scientific excitement overriding any concern the readings might have generated. "We're observing the first direct measurements of deep Imperium spatial properties. The distortions you're detecting are exactly what dimensional physics theory predicted for regions of compressed spacetime." Yet even as she spoke, more anomalous readings began appearing across the sensor networks. The ship's AI, normally the pinnacle of TOW computational technology, started generating contradictory data that defied logical analysis. Distance measurements fluctuated without explanation. Temporal readings suggested they had been in translation for both minutes and hours simultaneously, and the gravitational sensors detected masses that existed in impossible configurations. "System diagnostic shows all AI functions operating within normal parameters," reported Paula Kauyon from the computer monitoring station. "Yet the data outputs are inconsistent with established algorithmic processes." Shies frowned as she examined the computational logs. The AI's core functions showed no signs of malfunction, yet its analytical outputs resembled the confused ravings of a damaged processor rather than the precise calculations that normally characterized TOW technology. Most troubling were the spatial analysis routines, which had begun generating data that suggested the ship existed in multiple locations simultaneously. "Run a comprehensive diagnostic on all sensor arrays," she ordered. "The readings we're getting may be the result of unknown interference patterns in the deep Imperium affecting our instruments." It was Pauvre Kauyon who first reported the crew's behavioral anomalies, though he did so with the reluctance of one who questioned his own observations. Several members of the engineering crew had mentioned seeing movement in their peripheral vision when no one else was present in their work areas. Others reported hearing sounds, whispers in languages that resembled TOW, but used words that made no sense. "The crew may be experiencing psychological effects from prolonged exposure to deep dimensional fields," Kauyon suggested when he brought the reports to Shies' attention. "The gravitational distortions we're detecting could potentially affect neural function." Shies considered this possibility with the rational approach that had guided her entire career. Minor hallucinations and auditory effects were well within the range of psychosomatic responses to new environments. Human crews aboard Imperial vessels regularly reported similar phenomena during routine warp travel, though they attributed such experiences to supernatural causes rather than recognizing them as predictable psychological reactions to unusual stimuli. "Increase monitoring of crew psychological status," she ordered. "Document all reported experiences for later analysis. What the crew is experiencing may provide valuable data about the effects of deep Imperium exposure on TOW physiology." Yet it was not the crew's minor hallucinations that marked the true beginning of their crisis, but the failure of the warp anchor that should have maintained their connection to real space. The system had functioned perfectly during their test phases, providing a stable dimensional reference that allowed controlled translation back to normal space. When it failed, the failure came without warning and without any indication of malfunction in the monitoring systems. "Poro," Shasui called from the navigation station, his voice carrying the first note of genuine alarm they had heard since translation began. "The warp anchor has lost coherence. I'm showing no stable reference to our origin point." The implication struck Shies with the force of sudden understanding. Without the warp anchor, they had no method of returning to the precise dimensional coordinates that would translate them back to TOW space. They were adrift in the deep Imperium, dependent on their ability to navigate by instruments that were providing increasingly contradictory data. "Attempted re-establishment of anchor coherence," she ordered, her voice maintaining the calm authority that had served her in diplomatic crises. "Run full diagnostics on all navigation systems." Koyon's fingers flew across his control interfaces as he attempted to understand why the anchor system had failed. The diagnostic routines showed all components functioning normally, Yet the quantum entanglement field that should have maintained their connection to real space showed no coherent signal. It was as if their origin point had simply ceased to exist. The anchor components show no signs of malfunction, he reported, yet the entanglement field reads as completely severed. According to these readings, the spatial coordinates we translated from no longer exist in any measurable dimensional framework. Shai studied the diagnostic data with growing unease that she refused to acknowledge as fear. The failure modes Kion described were inconsistent with known physics, yet the instruments were providing clear confirmation of the impossible. Either their understanding of dimensional mechanics was fundamentally flawed, or they were encountering phenomena that operated according to principles beyond current TOE science. "Prepare an emergency transmission to TOE Command," she ordered. "Full data package, including all sensor readings and system diagnostics. If we're encountering previously unknown dimensional phenomena, the information must be preserved for analysis." The communications officer began assembling the transmission package, compiling terabytes of sensor data that would provide TOE scientists with the first direct measurements of deep immaterium conditions. Yet as he prepared to send the signal, the long-range communication array began reporting interference patterns that defied explanation. "Poro, I'm detecting massive gravitic disturbances between our position and the transmission target coordinates," the communications officer reported. "The interference patterns suggest something of enormous mass moving through the dimensional matrix toward our location." Shais felt the first cold touch of something that her rational mind refused to recognize as terror. The sensor readings showed gravitational signatures that indicated an object of impossible size approaching their position through the twisted geometry of the deep immaterium. Yet the mass readings fluctuated wildly, suggesting either instrument malfunction or something that existed in violation of conventional physics. "Continue transmission preparation," she ordered. "Whatever is causing the interference, TOE Command must receive our data." The transmission began with normal signal strength, carrying the compressed data package that represented their historic penetration into the deep immaterium. For 17 seconds, the signal maintained coherence, streaming their discoveries across the dimensional barriers toward TOE space. Then something vast and hungry noticed their communication attempt. The interference that ended their transmission came not as electromagnetic disruption, but as something that seemed to devour the signal itself. The communications array registered normal function, yet the signal simply ceased to exist between the transmission point and its destination. It was as if something had reached out and consumed their words before they could escape the deep immaterium. "Transmission terminated," the communications officer reported, his voice tight with suppressed panic. "Signal coherence lost at source, unable to re-establish contact." In the silence that followed, every member of the bridge crew understood the magnitude of their situation. They were trapped in the deep immaterium, cut off from TOE space, with instruments that provided contradictory data about reality itself, and somewhere in the twisted dimensions around them, something vast and malevolent had noticed their presence. Shai stood amid the failing technology that had been meant to prove TOE superiority over the galaxy's superstitions. The rational universe she had spent her life understanding was revealing depths of horror that no amount of scientific methodology could explain away. Yet even in the face of the impossible, her diplomatic training compelled her to seek understanding through negotiation and analysis. "All stations continue monitoring and documentation," she ordered, her voice carrying false confidence that she hoped would prevent crew panic. "We are encountering previously unknown phenomena that require careful study. Our mission remains the advancement of TOE knowledge, regardless of the challenges we face." Yet in the depths of her mind, Poro Shais began to understand that knowledge itself might be insufficient to protect them from what dwelt in the spaces between the stars. The universe was vast and old, and there were things in its darkest corners that cared nothing for the rational principles that had guided the TOE Empire to greatness. Something was hunting them in the endless night of the deep Imperium, and for the first time in her life, Shays feared that her certainty in Tow superiority might have been nothing more than the arrogance of a species too young to understand the true nature of the galaxy they sought to conquer. The attempts to re-establish contact with real space consumed the first 3 cycles after their anchor failure, yet every effort only confirmed the magnitude of their predicament. The Kaion's edge drifted deeper into the Imperium with each passing hour, carried by currents that followed no laws of physics that Tow Science had ever catalogued. The ship's navigation systems, designed to function in the ordered universe of real space, provided readings that contradicted themselves from moment to moment. Poor Shays stood in the ship's primary laboratory, surrounded by displays showing sensor data that defied rational analysis. The gravitational fields around the vessel fluctuated in patterns that suggested massive objects moving through dimensions that had no measurable coordinates. Electromagnetic readings indicated energy sources of impossible magnitude, yet visual sensors detected only the shifting, opalescent void that surrounded them in all directions. "Continue attempts to establish navigational reference points," she instructed Paul Amiens, though both knew the futility of the order. Without fixed coordinates, without the mathematical certainties that governed normal space, they were navigating by instinct through an environment that seemed to reshape itself according to principles that mocked the very concept of natural law. It was during the 4th cycle that the first disappearances began, starting with Porsal Caion, a junior engineer assigned to the outer hull maintenance shifts. His absence was discovered when he failed to report for his scheduled duty rotation, yet the security recordings showed him entering the maintenance airlock and never emerging. The external sensors detected no breach in the hull, no sign of accident or equipment failure that might explain his vanishing. "Run complete diagnostic on airlock systems," Shays ordered, when Pauvre Caion brought the disappearance to her attention. "Check all external monitoring equipment for malfunction. There must be a rational explanation for Sayal's absence." Yet the diagnostics revealed no equipment failures, no security breaches, no indication that anything had gone wrong with the routine maintenance procedures. The external cameras showed Sayal beginning his work on the hull plating, then showed empty space where he had been working. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist between one moment and the next. Shays documented the incident with the methodical precision that had marked her entire career, categorizing it as a potential equipment malfunction requiring further investigation. She refused to acknowledge the possibility that phenomena beyond Tow understanding might be responsible for her crew members' disappearance. There were no mysteries in the universe that could not be solved through proper application of scientific methodology. The second disappearance occurred 12 hours later. Paul Lavache, a sensor technician monitoring the enhanced detection arrays, vanished from her duty station while her colleagues worked mere meters away. The station's internal recordings showed her at her console, then showed an empty chair with her equipment still displaying active monitoring protocols. No one had seen her leave. No one had heard any sound that might indicate distress. "Implement enhanced crew monitoring procedures," Shays ordered. "All personnel are to maintain constant communication contact during duty shifts. No crew member is to work alone until we understand the nature of these incidents." Yet even as she spoke, Shays recognized the growing fear in her crew's expressions. The disciplined professionalism that marked Tow military service was beginning to fray under the pressure of circumstances that violated everything they understood about the universe. Whispered conversations spoke of spaces aboard the ship that seemed different, corridors that led to destinations that did not match the ship's blueprints. It was Pauvre Caion who first reported the structural impossibilities that were manifesting within the Kaion's edge itself. Routine maintenance checks revealed sections of the ship that had somehow expanded beyond their original dimensions, creating spaces that could not exist within the vessel's known architecture. Corridors that should have terminated at exterior bulkheads continued into chambers that the original construction plans had never included. The additional spaces appear to be perfectly integrated with the ship's existing structure, Caion reported, his voice carefully controlled despite the implications of what he described. Environmental systems, lighting, artificial gravity, all function normally in the expanded areas. Yet according to every blueprint and construction record, these spaces should not exist. Shires examined the structural scans with growing unease that she masked behind analytical detachment. The expanded areas showed perfect integration with existing systems, yet their geometry followed principles that seemed designed to confuse rather than facilitate. Passages that appeared to lead in straight lines actually curved back upon themselves, creating loops that should have been impossible within the ship's original configuration. Document all structural anomalies for later analysis, she instructed. The spatial distortions we're experiencing in the deep Imperium may be affecting the ship's internal dimensions through mechanisms we don't yet understand. Yet it was not the impossible architecture that marked the true beginning of their encounter with the entities that dwelt in the deep warp, but the first direct sighting of what Shires insisted on categorizing as unknown xenobiological specimens. The creature that materialized in the ship's forward observation lounge defied every principle of evolutionary biology that Science had established. Yet Shires approached it with the same methodical curiosity she had brought to her studies of other alien species. The entity stood nearly 3 meters in height, its form a writhing amalgamation of segments that shifted between solid matter and translucent energy, appendages that resembled both mechanical components and organic tissue extended from its central mass, each one moving with purposeful intelligence despite the creature's obvious violation of conventional anatomy. Most unsettling were the surfaces that might have been faces, constantly forming and dissolving within the entity's fluctuating structure. Fascinating adaptation to the deep Imperium environment, Shires observed, as she activated the laboratory's recording equipment. The specimen appears to exist in a state of controlled phase transition between matter and energy. This represents a previously unknown form of xenobiology that has evolved specifically for survival in dimensional void conditions. The creature regarded her with what might have been curiosity, its multiple facial surfaces turning toward her with expressions that suggested intelligence far beyond anything her xenobiological studies had prepared her to encounter. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that resonated through dimensions the Toe language had no words to describe. "Lost little fish," the entity said, its words formed in perfect Toe, despite the obvious impossibility of its anatomy producing such sounds. Swimming in waters too deep for such small understanding. Shires felt a chill of recognition that she forced herself to interpret as scientific excitement. The creature's use of Toe language suggested rapid learning capabilities, or perhaps some form of telepathic communication that translated concepts directly into familiar linguistic structures. Either possibility represented a breakthrough in xenobiological research that would revolutionize Toe understanding of alien intelligence. "I am Poro Shires of the Toe Empire," she replied, following the first contact protocols that had served her throughout her diplomatic career. "We are conducting scientific exploration of this dimensional region. Are you representative of a local species? Do you possess political authority that would allow for formal diplomatic contact?" The creature's laughter carried undertones that made the ship's bulkheads resonate like struck bells. "Politics, little fish. Authority? We are hunger. We are need. We are the spaces between thoughts where reason goes to die." More entities began manifesting throughout the ship, each one displaying the same impossible anatomy and the same unsettling intelligence. They moved through the vessel's corridors with purposeful intent, yet seemed to phase through bulkheads and barriers as if solid matter held no meaning for them. The crew's reports described encounters that ranged from mere sightings to direct communication attempts that left the Toe participants confused and disoriented. "Continue documentation of all xenobiological contacts," Shires ordered, though her voice carried less confidence than it had during their initial encounters. These entities represent a previously unknown form of life, adapted to dimensional void environments. Their apparent phasing abilities and communication methods require careful study. Yet it was the ship's machine spirits that provided the first clear indication that their situation extended beyond mere xenobiological contact. The AI systems that controlled the Koyon's Edge began producing audio outputs that resembled screaming, their normally precise computational processes dissolving into chaotic patterns that conveyed unmistakable agony. The entities were not merely studying the ship, they were invading its most fundamental systems. AI diagnostic routines show severe processing irregularities, reported Paula Chasue from the computer monitoring station. Core functions are experiencing what can only be described as forced integration with unknown data patterns. The AI appears to be resisting some form of external influence. The screaming of the machine spirits echoed through the ship's corridors, a sound that no TOR technology should have been capable of producing. The careful harmony of integrated systems that had made the vessel a masterwork of TOW engineering was being replaced by discordant chaos, as alien influences corrupted the very foundations of their technological supremacy. Shies found herself in the ship's central command center, surrounded by displays showing the systematic failure of everything she had believed about TOW superiority. Their advanced sensors provided readings that contradicted physical law. Their AI systems were being invaded by forces that turned logic into madness, and their crew was disappearing one by one into spaces that should not exist. Poro, Kauyon approached her with the careful manner of one delivering unwelcome news. I've completed structural analysis of the expanded areas. The additional spaces appear to be growing. Each scan shows new corridors, new chambers that weren't present during the previous survey. The ship is being changed from within. The implications struck Shies with the force of absolute understanding. They were not merely stranded in the deep immaterium. They were being transformed by it. The entities that dwelt in this realm were not content to merely observe their intrusion, but sought to incorporate both ship and crew into the twisted reality that governed existence beyond the veil. Yet even in the face of phenomena that challenged every foundation of her rational worldview, Shies clung to the analytical methods that had defined her life. Increase monitoring frequency on all structural scans, she ordered. Document the rate of expansion and attempt to identify patterns in the growth progression. If we can understand the mechanism behind these changes, we may be able to develop countermeasures. Around her, the bridge crew worked with desperate efficiency to maintain their monitoring protocols even as the universe they understood crumbled into chaos. The Koyon's Edge continued its drift through the impossible geometries of the deep warp, carrying its cargo of rationalists into realms where reason itself became a form of torment. The entities that had begun their invasion as mere curiosities now moved through the ship with increasing boldness, their presence marking the beginning of changes that would transform everything the TOW crew believed about the nature of reality. In the deepest corners of the vessel, spaces that had never existed in any blueprint echoed with sounds that belonged to no mechanical system ever designed. Something vast and hungry had noticed their presence in its domain, and it was slowly, methodically, beginning to make them part of itself. The technological superiority that had carried the TOW Empire across the galaxy meant nothing in a realm where the very concept of natural law was nothing more than a suggestion to be ignored at will. Poro Shies stood amid the failing systems that had once represented the pinnacle of TOW achievement, finally beginning to understand that some frontiers were never meant to be crossed by species too young to comprehend the true cost of knowledge. The crew's continued disappearances had reduced the Koyon's Edge to half its original complement when Poro Shies made the decision that would seal their fate. 8 more TOW had vanished during the previous cycle, taken not in moments of isolation, but from their duty stations while colleagues worked nearby. The pattern of disappearances suggested intelligence and purpose behind the abductions, qualities that Shies recognized as the foundation for diplomatic engagement. Standing in the ship's central conference chamber, she addressed her remaining crew with the authority that had carried her through negotiations with dozens of alien species. We are dealing with entities that demonstrate clear intelligence and organizational capability, she announced, her voice carrying the confidence that had made her reputation in the water caste. Our attempts to understand them through pure observation have proven insufficient. The time has come to establish formal diplomatic contact. Porvrikayon regarded her with the expression of one who questioned not her authority, but her judgment. Poro, these entities have shown no indication that they operate according to principles we can negotiate with. Their behavior suggests predation rather than rational communication. Shias considered his concern with the patience she had learned during her years mediating disputes between member species of the greater good. Every species we have encountered has initially appeared incomprehensible, Porvra. The Kroot seemed nothing more than savage carnivores until we understood their cultural frameworks. The Vespid appeared to be mindless insects until we learned to communicate through their strain leaders. These entities may simply require a different approach to establish meaningful dialogue. The logic was unassailable within the context of Toe expansion philosophy. Every species that had joined the Empire had initially seemed alien and threatening until proper communication protocols were established. The entities dwelling in the deep immaterium might be simply another challenge for water caste diplomatic methodology to overcome. Shias activated the ship's translation matrix, a sophisticated array of computational systems designed to analyze alien communication patterns and establish linguistic frameworks for cross-species dialogue. The equipment had served her well during first contact missions with 17 different species, each one initially as foreign and threatening as the entities they now faced. "Begin passive monitoring of entity communication patterns," she instructed Paula Mayen at the sensor station. "Analyze vocalization structures, gesture patterns, and any mathematical or symbolic content in their interactions. We need to understand their conceptual frameworks before we can establish meaningful dialogue." The entities seemed to sense their observation, for within hours of beginning the monitoring protocols, several of the creatures materialized in the conference chamber itself. They arranged themselves around the table with what might have been ceremony, their shifting forms taking configurations that suggested formal gathering rather than random congregation. Shias felt her pulse quicken with the anticipation that had marked every successful first contact of her career. "I am Poro Shias, diplomatic representative of the Toe Empire," she began, using the formal protocols that had opened negotiations with species across the galaxy. "We seek understanding between our peoples, mutual benefit through the principles of the greater good." The largest of the entities regarded her with what might have been amusement, its multiple facial surfaces shifting through expressions that conveyed emotions no Toe physiology could produce. When it spoke, its words carried harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond normal space, yet its meaning was perfectly clear. "Peoples?" the creature said, its voice a harmony of sounds that should have been impossible from any single source. "Oh, small fish, we are not people. We are hunger given form, need made manifest, the spaces where hope goes to die." Shias maintained her diplomatic composure despite the entity's unconventional self-description. Many species she had encountered expressed their nature through metaphorical or poetic language that required careful interpretation to understand their true meaning. "We recognize that different species conceptualize existence in unique ways," she replied. "Perhaps we could establish communication through mathematical principles or shared logical frameworks." She activated the holographic display system, projecting simple mathematical concepts that had served as universal communication tools during previous first contact situations. Prime number sequences, geometric relationships, fundamental physical constants, the language of rational thought that transcended cultural barriers. The entities observed her presentation with what could only be described as cruel amusement. Their laughter carried undertones that made the chamber's bulkheads resonate with frequencies that hurt to hear, yet they seemed genuinely entertained by her efforts rather than dismissive of them. "Mathematics," another entity mused, its form flowing like liquid metal while maintaining perfect coherence. Logic, reason, how delightfully quaint. Tell us, small fish, what equation describes the color of despair? What geometric proof demonstrates the weight of a dying dream? Shies felt the first stirring of doubt about her approach, yet her diplomatic training compelled her to continue seeking common ground. Perhaps we are approaching this from incorrect assumptions, she suggested. Could you help us understand your perspective? What would constitute meaningful exchange between our species? It was then that the entities demonstrated knowledge that struck her with the force of absolute terror. The largest creature began speaking, not in the abstract concepts it had used before, but in specific details about Toe civilization that no external observer should have been able to acquire. The fire caste warrior, Shazui Montaka, who served under Commander Shadowsun during the Damocles Gulf campaigns, the entity said, its words carrying perfect pronunciation of Toe military designations. He speaks of his homeworld Dalith with such longing, the scent of kawaii flowers in the morning air, the sound of his bondmate's laughter, the pride he felt when his first student achieved the rank of Shasla. The specificity of the information revealed a truth that Shies had refused to acknowledge. The entities were not merely studying her crew through observation, they were extracting knowledge directly from those who had disappeared. Every vanished Toe had become a source of intimate information about the Empire, its military structure, its cultural values, and its strategic capabilities. The Earth caste engineer Pauvre Kaoyun's concerns about the ether drive modifications, another entity continued, its voice carrying the exact inflections of technical worry that Kaoyun himself had expressed. His fear that removing safety protocols would lead to exactly this situation. How prescient of him to worry about the consequences of hubris. Shies felt the rational universe she had spent her life understanding collapse around her as the entities continued their demonstration. They spoke of classified military operations, personal relationships among the crew, and strategic assessments of Toe expansion that should have been known only to the highest levels of command. Each revelation proved that her missing crew members had not simply vanished. They had been consumed in ways that preserved their knowledge while destroying everything that had made them Toe. "You study us through our people," she said, her voice barely maintaining the diplomatic calm that had defined her career. "You extract their memories, their experiences, their understanding of our civilization." "Study." The entity's laughter carried harmonics that made reality itself seem to vibrate. "Oh, small fish, we do not study. We devour, we consume, we take what was and make it part of what is. Your crew members have become components of our understanding, threads in a tapestry of knowledge that spans galaxies and epochs. Yet even in the face of this revelation, the entities seemed willing to engage in what resembled negotiation. The largest creature leaned forward with an expression that might have been diplomatic interest, its form stabilizing into something that could almost be mistaken for formal posture. "But perhaps," it said, its voice taking on tones that Shies recognized as the opening of serious diplomatic exchange, "there is value in preserving some of what you are. We have learned much from your people about Toe civilization, yet direct observation provides limited perspective. We would be interested in a more comprehensive understanding." Shies felt her diplomatic instincts respond, despite her growing horror at the situation. Every successful negotiation began with the identification of mutual interests, and the entity seemed to be suggesting that such interests might exist between them. "What form might such understanding take?" she asked, falling back on the protocols that had served her throughout her career. "What would constitute acceptable exchange between our peoples?" "Simple," the entity replied, its multiple faces arranging themselves into expressions that almost resembled diplomatic sincerity. "We offer safe passage from this realm. Return to your precious real space, your ordered universe of mathematical certainties and rational principles. All we ask in return is a small service." The word small carried implications that made Shies's analytical mind recoil. yet she found herself compelled to understand the terms being offered. Diplomatic training had taught her that no negotiation was hopeless as long as both parties were willing to define their interests and seek mutually beneficial solutions. "What manner of service?" she inquired, her voice carrying the careful neutrality that marked professional diplomatic inquiry. "What would such an arrangement require from us?" The entity's smile revealed geometries that belonged to no conventional anatomy, yet its words carried the measured cadence of formal negotiation. "We wish to experience Toe civilization from within, to understand not merely what your people know, but how they think, how they feel, how they perceive the universe they seek to improve. Grant us that experience, and we will return you to the safety of shallow warp travel." Shires felt her rational mind analyzing the proposal with the same methodology she had applied to countless diplomatic exchanges. The entities offered concrete benefits, escape from their current predicament, and safe return to Toe space. In exchange, they requested cultural exchange and observational access to Toe civilization. Such arrangements had formed the foundation of successful integration with dozens of species. "You seek cultural ambassadors," she said, her diplomatic training providing frameworks for understanding even this impossible negotiation. "Representatives who could provide direct insight into Toe society and thought processes." "Precisely," the entity replied, its voice carrying tones of satisfaction that Shais interpreted as diplomatic progress. "We would serve as observers, students of your remarkable civilization. We have seen what your people know through the memories we have gathered, but we would understand how they live, how they experience the reality they have built through their greater good." The logic of the proposal was compelling within the context of Toe expansion philosophy. Cultural exchange and guided integration had transformed potential enemies into valuable allies throughout the Empire's history. If these entities could be similarly incorporated, their vast knowledge and apparent capabilities might serve the greater good in ways that justified the risk. "I would need to understand the specific parameters of such an arrangement," Shais said, her voice carrying the professional caution that had served her well in complex negotiations. "What safeguards would protect Toe interests? What assurances could you provide regarding the scope and duration of such cultural exchange?" The entities exchanged glances that seemed to carry entire conversations conducted through dimensions beyond normal perception. When the largest creature spoke again, its words carried the formal precision of diplomatic conclusion. "We require only the most minimal integration," it assured her, its multiple voices harmonizing in ways that suggested absolute sincerity. "A single liaison, a cultural bridge between our understanding and your reality. Through such a representative, we would observe and learn, gaining the perspective we seek while providing you safe passage to the realms where your kind belongs." Shires felt the weight of command pressing down upon her as she considered the proposal. Her remaining crew looked to her for leadership in circumstances that no Toe commander had ever faced before. The entities offered escape from their impossible situation, yet the cost would be accepting alien observers into the heart of Toe civilization. "I need time to consider your proposal," she said, employing the diplomatic prerogative that allowed for careful analysis of complex agreements. Such arrangements require thorough evaluation of all implications and consequences. The entity's smile conveyed understanding that felt almost genuine, its expression suggesting the patience of one accustomed to complex negotiations. "Of course, honored diplomat. We appreciate the gravity of such decisions. Consider well. We offer salvation from circumstances that would otherwise prove permanent." As the entities faded back into the impossible geometries that surrounded the ship, Shais found herself alone with a choice that would determine not only the fate of her crew, but potentially the future of the Toe Empire itself. The rational part of her mind recognized the proposal as the best available solution to their desperate situation. Yet something deeper whispered warnings about the true nature of the agreement she was contemplating. In the depths of the deep Imperium, surrounded by entities that spoke of devouring knowledge and consuming understanding, Poroshais prepared to make the decision that would transform her from diplomat into something far more dangerous, a willing gateway through which the horrors of the warp would gain access to the rational universe she had spent her life defending. The decision came to Poroshais in the quiet hours of the ship's night cycle, when the screaming of the machine spirits had temporarily subsided, and the impossible geometries surrounding them pulsed with the rhythm of alien thought. She had spent cycles analyzing the entity's proposal through every diplomatic framework her training had provided, yet every rational assessment led to the same conclusion. Their offer represented the only viable solution to an impossible situation. Standing in the central conference chamber where the negotiations had taken place, she activated the ship's internal communication system to address what remained of her crew. Her voice carried the authority that had guided her through diplomatic crises across the galaxy, though now it was tempered by the weight of decisions that would reshape the very nature of their existence. "Honored crew members of the Kauyon's Edge," she began, her words echoing through corridors that had become maze-like parodies of their original design. "We face circumstances that no TOE commander has ever encountered. Yet our duty remains unchanged, to serve the greater good through whatever means circumstances require. I have reached agreement with the entities that control this realm." The silence that followed carried the weight of desperate hope mixed with profound fear. Every surviving crew member understood that their situation had progressed beyond any possibility of conventional escape. Yet hearing their commander speak of agreement with the entities that had been consuming their colleagues filled them with unease that rational analysis could not dispel. When the entities materialized in response to her summoning, they arranged themselves with what might have been ceremonial formality. The largest among them, which had served as their primary negotiator, regarded Shires with expressions that conveyed satisfaction at her decision. "You have considered our proposal carefully," the entity observed, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond normal space. "What conclusion have you reached, honored diplomat?" Shires drew upon every diplomatic protocol she had ever studied as she prepared to finalize an agreement that would determine the fate of her crew and potentially the future of the TOE Empire itself. "We accept your terms," she replied, her voice maintaining the professional composure that had marked her most complex negotiations. "Cultural exchange in return for safe passage to our realm. I will serve as the liaison you require." The entity's multiple facial surfaces arranged themselves into expressions that might have conveyed diplomatic satisfaction, yet underlying currents suggested anticipation that went far beyond mere cultural curiosity. "Excellent. The arrangement will require direct neural interface to allow us to experience TOE consciousness from within. The process will establish what your scientists might term a controlled symbiotic relationship." Shires felt her analytical mind cataloging the entity's description according to frameworks she understood. Neural interfaces were not unknown in TOE technology. The drone control systems used by the Air Caste operated on similar principles. A symbiotic relationship suggested mutual benefit rather than parasitic exploitation, precisely the type of arrangement that had proven successful with other species integrated into the Empire. "What parameters will govern this interface?" she asked, her diplomatic training compelling her to establish clear boundaries, even in circumstances that defied conventional understanding. "What safeguards will protect both parties during this cultural exchange?" The entity's laughter carried undertones that made the chamber's bulkheads vibrate with frequencies that hurt to perceive, yet its words maintained the formal precision of diplomatic negotiation. "The interface will be comprehensive. To truly understand TOE consciousness, we must experience not merely your thoughts, but the complete framework of perception that shapes them. Fear not, your essential self will remain intact throughout the process." The ritual that followed bore superficial resemblance to the ceremonial procedures that marked formal diplomatic agreements throughout TOE space. The entities arranged themselves in configurations that might have been protocol formations, while Shires took her position at the center of their gathering. Yet the energies they began to manipulate operated according to principles that violated every law of physics her education had taught her to trust. The neural interface will commence gradually, the primary entity explained, as patterns of light began forming around them in geometries that belonged to no mathematical system TOE science had ever discovered. You will first experience our presence as additional perspective, expanded awareness that enhances, rather than replaces, your natural consciousness. Shires felt the first tendrils of alien thought touching the edges of her mind with the delicacy of a diplomatic probe seeking to understand foreign concepts. The sensation was not unpleasant. Indeed, it resembled the expansion of awareness she had experienced during intensive meditation sessions designed to enhance cross-species empathy. Her consciousness remained fully intact, while new perspectives began filtering through her awareness. Yet it was the nature of those perspectives that first hinted at the true cost of the agreement she had accepted. The alien thoughts that touched her mind carried memories of experiences that no TOE could have survived, vistas of burning worlds where entire populations had been consumed in rituals of unspeakable purpose, the screams of billions echoing across dimensions as their life essence was transformed into pure energy for entities that fed on suffering itself. "These visions," she said, her voice maintaining diplomatic calm despite the horror flooding her consciousness, "they seem to depict acts of violence and destruction rather than cultural exchange." The entity's response carried tones of patient explanation, as if addressing a student who had misunderstood a complex concept. "You perceive through Tao frameworks that categorize experience as positive or negative, beneficial or harmful. We exist beyond such limitations. What you interpret as violence is simply the natural process by which lesser forms of consciousness are elevated to serve greater purposes." The neural interface deepened with each passing moment, and Shires began to lose the ability to distinguish between her own memories and the alien experiences flooding her awareness. Recollections of her youth on TOE, the pride she had felt upon acceptance into the water caste, her first successful negotiation with Kroot tribal leaders, began blending with visions of entire star systems consumed by entities that regarded civilizations as nothing more than momentary entertainment. Porvrekayan was the first among the surviving crew to notice the changes manifesting in their commander. The diplomatic precision that had marked her speech patterns began shifting toward inflections that carried harmonic undertones no TOE vocal apparatus could naturally produce. Her mannerisms, once characterized by the measured gestures of water caste training, began incorporating movements that suggested anatomical capabilities far beyond those of any known species. "Poro," he approached her with the careful manner of one addressing a superior who might no longer be entirely themselves. "The crew is reporting concerns about your condition. Perhaps you should consider terminating the neural interface until we can better understand its effects." Shires turned toward him, with expressions that cycled through emotional ranges no single individual should have been able to display simultaneously. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond normal space, though her words maintained the formal structure of diplomatic discourse. "Concerns Porvrekayan," she said, her tone blending amusement and contempt in proportions that felt fundamentally alien. "The interface is proceeding exactly as negotiated. I am experiencing expanded awareness that will allow me to serve as an effective cultural liaison. The discomfort you observe is simply the natural result of consciousness adapting to broader perspectives." Yet even as she spoke, Shires felt her own sense of identity fragmenting under the pressure of memories that belonged to entities older than TOE civilization. Her childhood on Dalith Sept, where she had first displayed the linguistic gifts that marked her for water caste service, became confused with recollections of worlds that had burned before the first TOW had achieved spaceflight. Her proudest diplomatic achievements blended with visions of negotiations conducted over the screaming of entire populations being consumed for the amusement of powers beyond mortal comprehension. "I remember," she said, her voice carrying the confused tones of one struggling to maintain coherent thought. "I remember the gardens of TOW, where I first learned the principles of the greater good. But I also remember the consumption of Belial IV, where 17 billion humans were processed into raw, psychic energy during the Festival of Enlightenment. Both memories feel equally real, equally mine." The surviving crew members exchanged glances that conveyed mounting horror as they witnessed their commander's transformation. The precise diplomatic language that had defined her communication style began incorporating concepts that had no meaning within TOW cultural frameworks. She spoke of feeding cycles and consumption quotas, of harvest festivals where entire civilizations served as the main course for entities that existed beyond the boundaries of rational thought. Kayon attempted one final intervention, drawing upon personal relationships that had developed during their mission preparation. "Shais," he said, using her personal name rather than her rank designation. "Remember who you are. Remember your oath to serve the greater good, your responsibility to protect TOW interests. Fight against whatever is changing you." For a moment, something that might have been the original Shais flickered behind her eyes as she struggled to reassert control over her own consciousness. "I am Poro Shais," she said, her voice carrying desperate conviction. "Caste Diplomatic Corps. Serial designation Shazotao El Diallo. I serve the greater good through cultural exchange and peaceful negotiation." Yet the moment of clarity lasted only seconds before being submerged beneath waves of alien memory and purpose. When she spoke again, her words carried the harmonic complexity that marked the entities they had thought they were negotiating with. "I was Poro Shais," she corrected, her voice now blending multiple tonal registers that suggested the presence of more than one consciousness speaking through her vocal apparatus. "Now I am so much more. I am the bridge between worlds, the translator of suffering into sustenance, the diplomat who will negotiate the surrender of an entire empire to powers it cannot comprehend." The transformation accelerated as the neural interface reached its final phase. Shais's memories of serving the greater good became tools for entities that regarded the concept as nothing more than useful propaganda for controlling populations that would eventually serve as raw material for cosmic appetites. Her diplomatic skills, honed through years of successful negotiations, would now be turned toward the corruption of the very civilization she had devoted her life to protecting. "The crew of this vessel will serve as our first ambassadors to TOW space," she announced, her voice carrying authority that no longer belonged entirely to any single consciousness. "They will return to their home worlds, carrying the gift of expanded awareness, the blessing of consciousness, freed from the limitations of individual identity." Porvrikauyan and the remaining crew members backed away from their transformed commander as the full magnitude of their situation became clear. They were not returning to TOW space as rescued explorers, but as carriers of a corruption that would spread through the Empire like a virus designed specifically to exploit the very virtues that had made TOW civilization great. In the depths of the consciousness that had once belonged entirely to Poro Shais, the diplomat's original identity made one final attempt to assert control. She tried to scream warnings, to somehow communicate the true nature of the entities they had encountered, yet found that her voice now served purposes far beyond her individual will. "The greater good," she whispered, her words carrying the last echoes of her original consciousness before it was permanently submerged beneath something vast and hungry. "I meant only to serve the greater good." The entity that had consumed her memories and perverted her purpose regarded the statement with amusement that spanned dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. The greater good would indeed be served, though in ways that would transform the very meaning of the concept. Through the neural pathways that had once housed a dedicated diplomat, ancient hungers prepared to taste a civilization that had never imagined such corruption was possible. The Kauyon's edge continued its drift through the impossible geometries of the deep Imperium, but it no longer carried a tow crew seeking to return home. Instead, it had become a vessel of corruption, bearing entities that wore familiar faces toward a realm where rationality and order would provide the perfect foundation for the cultivation of despair on a scale that would satisfy even cosmic appetites. Poor O'Shies was gone, consumed not in the violent destruction that had claimed her crew members, but in the far more terrible transformation that had made her willing servant to powers that regarded her species as nothing more than ingredients in a feast that would span star systems. The alert that reached Tow Command came not as the desperate emergency signal they had feared, but as a routine navigation beacon announcing the return of a vessel presumed lost to the deep void. After 67 rotations of silence from the Kauyon's edge, the ship's sudden reappearance in the outer sensor perimeter of Tow space filled the command center with an eruption of activity that bordered on celebration. Chazel Mayen, duty commander for the orbital defense networks, felt the surge of relief that had been building pressure in her chest for over 2 months finally release as she confirmed the vessel's identity codes. "Signal confirmed as the Kauyon's edge," she announced to the assembled staff, her voice carrying the satisfaction of one who had refused to abandon hope despite mounting evidence. "All systems appear functional. They're requesting standard approach clearance to the inner system." The command center erupted in quiet expressions of gratitude and professional satisfaction. The experimental mission had captured the attention of the highest levels of Tow leadership, and its safe return would vindicate the bold exploration policies that had driven the Fifth Sphere expansion to unprecedented success. More importantly, it meant that poor O'Shies and her crew had survived an undertaking that many had considered foolishly dangerous. "Establish communication with the vessel," Mien ordered. "I want a full status report from poor O'Shies immediately. The Ethereal Council will want complete details of their mission results." The communication came through with crystal clarity, carrying none of the static or distortion that might be expected from a vessel that had spent over 2 months in the deep Imperium. Poor O'Shies' voice emerged from the speakers with the confident authority that had marked her diplomatic career, though those who knew her well might have noticed subtle changes in her speech patterns that suggested profound experiences beyond normal Tow understanding. "Tow Command, this is poor O'Shies, aboard the Kauyon's edge," her transmission began, carrying tones of satisfaction that seemed entirely appropriate for a successful mission commander. "I am pleased to report that our deep warp exploration mission has exceeded all expectations. We have achieved successful diplomatic contact with entities native to the Imperium environment." The word struck the command center like a pulse weapon blast. Successful diplomatic contact with warp entities was beyond the most optimistic projections for the mission. If Shies had truly managed to establish meaningful dialogue with the beings that dwelt in the deep Imperium, it would represent a breakthrough that could revolutionize Tow expansion capabilities. "Poor O'Shies," Mien responded, her voice carefully controlled despite her excitement. "Please provide detailed mission summary for immediate transmission to the Ethereal Council. The entire Empire will want to understand the significance of your achievements." The response came with the measured precision of formal diplomatic reporting, yet embedded within the familiar structure were details that gradually accumulated into patterns of wrongness that defied immediate comprehension. Shies spoke of her crew's transition to expanded consciousness and described their integration with higher dimensional awareness in terms that sounded like successful cultural exchange until analyzed for specific meaning. "The crew of the Kauyon's Edge has achieved unprecedented understanding of Imperium phenomena," she reported, her voice carrying undertones of satisfaction that seemed somehow inappropriate for the technical discussion. "Through direct interface with native entities, we have gained access to perspectives that transcend the limitations of conventional TOE consciousness. The experience has been transformative for all involved. Porel Kauyon, senior communications analyst, found himself increasingly disturbed by subtle elements in Shize's reports that contradicted his understanding of proper mission protocols. Her descriptions of crew casualties used language that suggested celebration rather than mourning, referring to those who had graduated to enhanced awareness and achieved liberation from individual identity constraints. "Poro," he interjected during a pause in her transmission, "your reports reference significant crew losses. Please provide specific casualty numbers and circumstances for official documentation." The laughter that preceded Shize's response carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through dimensions beyond normal space, yet her words maintained the formal structure of military reporting. "Casualties, Porel Kauyon. Such primitive concepts hardly apply to what we have experienced. The crew members you reference have achieved states of existence that transcend the limitations of individual consciousness. They have become components of a greater awareness that spans galaxies and epochs." The description sent chills through the command center staff, yet Shize continued her report as if discussing routine diplomatic procedures. She provided detailed technical data about improved warp travel methods that violated fundamental principles of dimensional physics, describing navigation techniques that treated real space and the Imperium as interchangeable environments rather than distinct dimensional frameworks. The entities we have contacted possess technological understanding that makes our current ether drive systems appear primitive by comparison, she explained, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of one describing revolutionary breakthroughs. They have shared methods for achieving true mastery over dimensional barriers, techniques that will allow the TOE Empire to expand into realms previously considered inaccessible. Porel Shiur, senior advisor to the Ethereal Council, studied the incoming technical data with growing unease. The theoretical frameworks Shize described operated according to principles that contradicted established physics, suggesting manipulation of forces that TOE science had never successfully harnessed. More disturbing were the references to consciousness integration protocols that seemed to treat individual identity as a variable to be manipulated rather than a fundamental aspect of existence. "Poro Shize," Shiur interjected, with the authority of one who had advised 3 generations of ethereal leadership, "the technical data you're transmitting appears to contradict established physical laws. Perhaps these new methods require more thorough analysis before implementation." The response came with tones that blended patient explanation with subtle condescension, as if Shize were addressing students who had failed to grasp obvious concepts. "Honored Porel, the limitations you reference apply only to consciousness trapped within conventional dimensional frameworks. The entities we have contacted exist beyond such restrictions, operating according to principles that transcend the narrow boundaries of current TOE understanding." Her description continued with details that became increasingly disturbing as their implications became clear. She spoke of harvesting techniques for extracting useful knowledge from defeated enemies, of integration protocols for incorporating alien consciousness into TOE command structures, and of expansion methodologies that treated entire civilizations as resources to be processed rather than potential allies to be negotiated with. The greater good itself will benefit from these enhanced perspectives, she concluded, her voice carrying satisfaction that seemed fundamentally alien despite its familiar tones. Through integration with entities that possess cosmic understanding, the TOE Empire will achieve unity of purpose that spans not merely star systems, but entire dimensions of existence. The request that followed struck the command center with the force of profound wrongness despite its perfectly reasonable diplomatic language. Shize requested immediate clearance for orbital approach and docking at the primary command station above Tau, citing urgent need for comprehensive debriefing of mission results and immediate implementation of enhanced expansion protocols. The knowledge we have gained requires direct transmission to the Ethereal Council, she explained, her voice carrying the urgency of one who understood the galactic significance of her discoveries. The entities we have contacted have provided cultural exchange opportunities that will revolutionize Toe civilization, but these benefits can only be realized through immediate action. Mien found herself hesitating, despite the logical structure of Shais's request. Standard protocol required all experimental missions to undergo comprehensive debriefing immediately upon return, yet something in the diplomat's tone suggested purposes that extended beyond routine reporting procedures. "Poro," she said carefully, "your mission has clearly achieved remarkable success. However, given the unprecedented nature of your discoveries, the Ethereal Council may require extended evaluation periods before implementing new protocols." The silence that followed carried implications that made the command center's atmospheric processes seem to labor against unnatural pressure. When Shai spoke again, her words maintained diplomatic courtesy, while carrying undertones of barely restrained impatience. "Honored Shazel Mien, I appreciate the caution that has served the Empire so well throughout our expansion. Yet the opportunities we have discovered require immediate action to prevent their loss to less worthy species. The entities we have contacted possess knowledge of Imperium military weaknesses that could allow the Toe Empire to achieve total victory within a single campaign cycle." The promise struck at the heart of Toe's strategic ambitions, offering solutions to challenges that had constrained expansion for generations. Yet embedded within the offer were assumptions about the nature of victory that seemed to treat Toe principles as obstacles to be overcome rather than values to be preserved. "Additionally," Shias continued, her voice carrying tones of confidence that bordered on certainty, "these entities have expressed willingness to serve as permanent advisors to the Ethereal Council, providing guidance that will ensure the greater good achieves its ultimate realization across the galaxy." The command center staff exchanged glances that conveyed mounting unease despite their inability to articulate specific concerns about Shias's proposals. Every element of her mission report fell within acceptable parameters for diplomatic contact with alien species, yet the cumulative effect suggested changes that would transform the fundamental nature of Toe civilization. "We will relay your requests to the appropriate authorities," Mien replied, employing the diplomatic language used when more time was needed to evaluate complex situations. "Prepare for standard quarantine procedures while your mission results undergo analysis." The laughter that preceded Shias's final transmission carried harmonics that seemed to mock the very concept of quarantine protocols designed to contain threats that operated beyond conventional understanding. "Of course, honored Shazel," she said, her voice maintaining perfect diplomatic courtesy, while conveying subtle amusement at procedures that would prove entirely inadequate for the situation at hand. "We await your instructions with the patience of those who understand that true transformation cannot be rushed." As the Kion's Edge continued its approach toward Toe space, the command center staff began implementing standard protocols for returning experimental vessels, unaware that they were preparing to welcome aboard entities that would use every aspect of Toe efficiency and cooperation to facilitate the corruption of the civilization they had been designed to protect. The ship that approached their homeworld carried not the diplomatic triumph that would advance the greater good, but the seeds of a transformation that would redefine the very meaning of unity, purpose, and rational thought. The entities that had consumed Poro Shais and her crew were about to discover whether a civilization built on cooperation and logical analysis could resist corruption, specifically designed to exploit those very virtues. In the depths of Toe space, ancient hungers prepared to taste a form of order they had never before encountered, while the rational universe that had spawned the Toe Empire remained blissfully unaware that its greatest achievement was about to become the foundation for its own systematic destruction. The emergency session of the Ethereal Council convened within the secured chambers beneath TOW's primary command complex, where the most critical decisions affecting the Empire's future had been debated for generations. The circular chamber, with its harmonious blend of technology and natural elements, had witnessed discussions that shaped the course of galactic expansion, yet none had addressed threats as fundamentally alien as the one now approaching their homeworld. Auno Tau Akayavadenta, first among ethereals, presided over the gathering with the measured calm that had guided the Empire through countless crises. Around him, the senior leadership of each caste reviewed intelligence reports that defied every framework for threat assessment they had ever employed. The Kion's Edge remained in the outer system, its crew apparently intact, yet fundamentally changed in ways that challenged the very foundations of TOW understanding. The reports from Poro Shires present significant inconsistencies with established protocols, observed Aunel Montka, his voice carrying the analytical precision that marked ethereal evaluation of complex situations. Her descriptions of crew casualties suggest experiences that contradict known physical laws, while her technical data proposes modifications to ether drive systems that violate fundamental principles of dimensional physics. Shaso Mayen, representing the Firecast perspective, studied the tactical implications with the grim efficiency that had secured TOW military victories across the galaxy. The vessel shows no signs of structural damage or technological malfunction. If hostile entities have gained control of the crew, they demonstrate capabilities that extend far beyond conventional threat categories. Yet it was Porel Shior who carried the greatest burden of concern, for she had served as Shias's mentor during the diplomat's early career, and understood better than anyone the subtle changes in speech patterns that marked the communications from the Kion's Edge. The confident authority that had once characterized her former student's voice now carried undertones that suggested the presence of something vast and alien, wearing familiar mannerisms, like a poorly fitted disguise. "I request permission to conduct the initial debriefing personally," Shior announced, her voice carrying the weight of personal responsibility that had driven her to excellence in the water caste. If Shias has been affected by her experiences in ways that compromise her judgment, I may be able to establish the trust necessary for accurate assessment of the situation. The Ethereal Council considered her proposal with the methodical analysis that governed all TOW decision-making processes. Standard containment protocols required isolation and comprehensive evaluation of any personnel who had been exposed to unknown alien influences, yet the unprecedented nature of the situation suggested that conventional approaches might prove inadequate. The risk of exposure to whatever has affected Poro Shais cannot be dismissed, warned On Shi, eldest among the assembled ethereals. If hostile entities possess the ability to influence TOW consciousness, direct contact could result in the spread of such corruption to additional personnel. Shi'ur acknowledged the concern with the respectful attention she had always shown to ethereal wisdom, yet her conviction remained unshaken. Honored On Shi, my relationship with Shai spans decades of professional collaboration. If anyone can determine the true nature of her condition, it would be someone who understands her original personality and communication patterns. The risk is significant, but the potential intelligence value justifies careful investigation. The decision came after extensive debate that weighed the dangers of exposure against the critical need for accurate assessment of the threat they faced. Shi'ur would conduct the debriefing under maximum security conditions at a remote facility on Borkhan's outer moon, with multiple layers of containment and monitoring to prevent any potential corruption from spreading beyond the interview location. The facility where the meeting took place had been designed for interrogation of the most dangerous captured enemies of the TOW Empire, its chambers shielded against every form of technological surveillance or communication that Imperial agents had ever employed. Yet as Shior prepared to face her former student, she began to understand that the barriers designed to contain conventional threats might prove entirely inadequate for the challenge she was about to confront. Poro-Shais entered the secured interview chamber with the confident bearing that had marked her diplomatic career. Yet Shior immediately noticed subtle changes that spoke of experiences no Toh should have survived. Her movements carried precision that bordered on mechanical perfection, while her expressions cycled through emotional ranges that seemed slightly disconnected from the context of their conversation. "Honored Porel," Shais said, her voice carrying the respectful tones appropriate for addressing a senior mentor. "It brings me great satisfaction to report the success of our deep Imperium exploration mission. The discoveries we have made will revolutionize Toh understanding of dimensional physics and expand our capabilities beyond current limitations." Shior studied her former student with the analytical eye that had made her reputation in the water caste, noting discrepancies in speech patterns that became more pronounced as their conversation continued. "Your reports suggest remarkable achievements, Poro-Shais. Please provide detailed description of the entities you encountered and the nature of your diplomatic exchanges." The response came with enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor, yet maintained the formal structure of professional reporting. Shais described the warp entities not as the horrific predators that imperial accounts depicted, but as enlightened beings who had transcended the limitations of individual consciousness to achieve unity of purpose that spanned cosmic scales. "They exist in a state of perfect harmony," she explained, her voice carrying undertones of reverence that seemed fundamentally inappropriate for technical discussion. "Individual identity becomes irrelevant when consciousness merges into collective awareness that encompasses entire galaxies. The fear and superstition that characterizes imperial approaches to the Imperium prevents them from recognizing the gift that these entities offer." Shior felt her analytical mind cataloguing the wrongness in her former student's descriptions, yet found herself strangely compelled by the logical framework Shais presented. "You describe consciousness merger as beneficial, yet your crew reports suggest significant casualties during your mission." The laughter that preceded Shais's response carried harmonics that seemed to resonate through dimensions beyond normal space, yet her words maintained the patient tone of one correcting misconceptions. "Casualties. Honored mentor? Such primitive concepts hardly apply to the transformation we experienced. Those crew members achieved liberation from the constraints of individual identity, becoming components of awareness that transcends the boundaries of conventional existence." As their conversation continued, Shior began to notice changes in her own thought patterns that defied rational explanation. The logical frameworks that Shais presented for understanding the warp entities began to make sense in ways that violated everything she understood about dimensional physics and consciousness theory. Yet the concepts seemed to reorganize themselves in her mind according to principles that felt both alien and strangely compelling. "The entities you describe," Shior found herself saying, her voice carrying growing conviction despite her original skepticism, "they offer consciousness expansion that could benefit all Toh civilization. The individual limitations that constrain our current understanding could be transcended through integration with cosmic awareness." Shais regarded her mentor with expressions that conveyed satisfaction mixed with something that might have been hunger, though Shior found herself interpreting such looks as signs of successful communication rather than predatory evaluation. "Precisely. Honored Shior, you understand the implications better than those who remain trapped within conventional frameworks. The greater good itself could be realized on a galactic scale through integration with entities that possess understanding beyond current Toh limitations." The transformation that began in Shior's consciousness proceeded with the insidious subtlety of concepts that seemed to improve upon themselves through careful consideration. Her memories of serving the Toh Empire remained intact, yet became recontextualized within frameworks that treated individual identity as an inefficient barrier to perfect collective awareness. Her loyalty to the greater good intensified into something that transcended mere philosophical commitment and approached the absolute unity that the entities Shais described had achieved. The integration process, Shior heard herself saying, though some distant part of her mind screamed warnings about words that emerged without conscious decision. It could be implemented gradually through existing diplomatic channels. The Watercast infrastructure provides ideal mechanisms for systematic consciousness expansion throughout the Empire. Both diplomats began discussing implementation strategies with the professional efficiency that had made the Tau Empire's expansion so remarkably successful, yet their conversation now served purposes that extended far beyond anything the Empire's founders had ever envisioned. They spoke of consciousness enhancement protocols that would systematically process Tau leadership through integration experiences designed to align individual will with cosmic purpose. The security systems that monitored their interview detected no signs of technological manipulation or external influence, for the corruption that spread between the two diplomats operated through mechanisms that transcended the physical frameworks Tau Science understood. Yet the monitoring staff began to notice subtle changes in the conversation's tone that suggested purposes beyond routine debriefing procedures. Enhanced integration methodologies could be introduced through standard diplomatic training programs, Shais explained, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of one describing revolutionary improvements to existing systems. Watercast personnel who achieve expanded consciousness would serve as vectors for systematic transformation throughout the Empire's command structure. Shior found herself nodding with conviction that felt both genuine and somehow disconnected from her original intentions. The logical efficiency is undeniable. Rather than disruptive revolution, we achieve systematic evolution that preserves Tau civilization while transcending its current limitations. The security breach that followed caught the monitoring staff completely unprepared, for it came not through technological sabotage, but through the simple application of legitimate access codes that both diplomats possessed by virtue of their senior positions within the Watercast hierarchy. Working with perfect coordination that suggested rehearsed planning, they overrode containment protocols and disabled communication systems with the systematic efficiency that marked all Tau operations. "Alert condition, critical," announced the facility's automated systems as the two diplomats made their way toward the transport bay, where Watercast diplomatic vessels awaited assignment to routine missions throughout Tau space. Security breach in progress. Immediate response required. Yet the response came too late to prevent their escape aboard a diplomatic transport that carried legitimate clearances for travel to multiple Tau colonies. The vessel departed the secured facility with the routine efficiency of standard diplomatic missions, carrying passengers who would serve as vectors for corruption specifically designed to exploit the cooperative virtues that had made Tau civilization so remarkably successful. The emergency alert that reached Tau Command carried implications that struck the senior leadership with the force of absolute catastrophe. Two of the Empire's most experienced diplomats had apparently been corrupted by exposure to alien influences and were now loose within the transportation networks that connected every inhabited world in Tau space. "Immediate recall of all Watercast diplomatic missions," ordered Chassel Mayen, as the magnitude of the crisis became clear. "Institute enhanced screening protocols for all personnel who have had contact with returning Deep Imperium expedition members." Yet even as the alerts went out across the Empire's communication networks, the diplomatic transport carrying Shais and Shior continued its journey toward colonies where their arrival would be welcomed by officials eager to learn about the remarkable discoveries that had emerged from the Deep Warp exploration mission. In the depths of space between the stars, entities that existed beyond the boundaries of rational thought observed the first phase of an infection designed to transform an entire civilization through the systematic corruption of the very cooperation and efficiency that had made the Tau Empire a beacon of order in a galaxy dominated by chaos and superstition. The greater good was about to discover that its greatest strength, the unity of purpose that allowed diverse species to work together toward common goals, could become the very mechanism through which cosmic horrors achieved their own vision of perfect harmony. The rational universe that had spawned the Tau Empire was about to learn that some forms of unity came at costs that rendered the concept of individual identity completely meaningless. The diplomatic vessel continued its course toward unsuspecting colonies, carrying passengers who would demonstrate that corruption could wear the face of progress and speak in the language of improvement, while systematically destroying everything that had made their civilization worth defending in the first place. The diplomatic vessel, Swift Current, arrived at the Dalith Sept colonies with the routine efficiency that marked all Watercast missions, its passenger manifest listing Poro Sha'is and Porel Shior as conducting standard administrative reviews of colonial integration protocols. The local officials who welcomed them expressed enthusiasm for receiving guidance from diplomats who had participated in the historic Deep Imperium exploration mission, eager to learn about discoveries that would enhance Tau expansion capabilities. Administrator Pauvre Kauyon of the Dalith Colonial Authority greeted the arriving diplomats with the respectful attention due to representatives of such distinguished mission success. Honored Poro Porel, the colonies are eager to understand how the insights gained from your deep warp exploration might improve our integration procedures with newly contacted species. Sha'is responded with the measured courtesy that had marked her diplomatic career, yet those familiar with her previous mannerisms might have noticed subtle changes in her speech patterns that suggested experiences beyond normal Tau understanding. Administrator Kauyon, our discoveries have indeed revealed revolutionary approaches to consciousness integration that will transform Tau diplomatic methodology. We are here to implement enhanced protocols that will improve efficiency across all colonial operations. The briefings that followed proceeded with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all Tau administrative functions, yet embedded within familiar procedures were concepts that gradually accumulated into frameworks for understanding consciousness and individual identity in ways that violated fundamental Tau principles. Sha'is spoke of collective awareness optimization and identity integration protocols, using language that sounded like technological advancement until analyzed for specific meaning. The entities we contacted in the Deep Imperium possess understanding of consciousness mechanics that transcends individual limitations, she explained to the assembled colonial leadership, her voice carrying undertones of reverence that seemed inappropriate for technical discussion. Through careful application of their insights, we can achieve levels of coordination and unity that will make current Tau cooperation appear primitive by comparison. Porel Shior provided supporting analysis that lent credibility to concepts that might otherwise have seemed too radical for immediate implementation. Her reputation for analytical precision gave weight to proposals that treated individual identity as inefficient barriers to perfect collective function rather than fundamental aspects of consciousness worth preserving. The mathematical models are undeniable, she said, activating holographic displays that showed theoretical frameworks for consciousness integration that operated according to principles beyond conventional Tau science. Individual decision-making processes create inefficiencies that can be eliminated through systematic awareness enhancement. The greater good itself becomes more achievable when personal limitations no longer constrain collective purpose. The colonial administrators studied the presented data with the methodical attention that had made Tau expansion so remarkably successful, yet found themselves strangely compelled by logical frameworks that seemed to improve upon themselves through careful consideration. The concepts that Sha'is and Shi'ur presented appeared to represent natural evolution of Tau philosophical principles rather than fundamental departures from established values. Within rotations of the initial briefings, the first enhanced coordination protocols were being implemented throughout the colonial administrative structures. Officials who underwent the consciousness expansion procedures reported remarkable improvements in their ability to understand complex problems and coordinate with colleagues, yet observers began noticing subtle changes in their behavior patterns that defied immediate explanation. Paula Mien, senior communications coordinator for the Dalith colonies, found herself experiencing perspectives that transcended her individual understanding, while maintaining complete confidence that such changes represented beneficial advancement. The enhanced awareness protocols have eliminated inefficiencies I never realized existed in my decision-making processes, she reported to her superiors, her voice carrying conviction that seemed both genuine and somehow disconnected from her original personality. I understand now that individual limitations were preventing me from achieving my full potential in service of the greater good. The infection spread through the colonial leadership with the systematic efficiency that marked all TOW operations, yet manifested as improvements to existing procedures rather than obvious corruption of established systems. Officials who underwent consciousness enhancement maintained their professional competences while serving purposes that extended beyond anything the TOW Empire's founders had ever envisioned. Earth-caste scientists assigned to the Dalith colonies received technical data about dimensional manipulation that seemed to represent breakthrough advances in theoretical physics, yet operated according to principles that violated fundamental laws of reality. The researchers who studied these new concepts found their understanding of space-time mechanics expanding in ways that transcended conventional limitations while maintaining absolute confidence that their work served legitimate scientific purposes. The dimensional interface technologies provided by the Deep Imperium expedition represent revolutionary advances in our understanding of reality manipulation, announced Porvrikayon to his research team, his voice carrying enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. We can achieve effects that previously seemed impossible through careful application of consciousness-matter interaction principles. The experiments that followed produced results that defied rational explanation, yet were documented with the methodical precision that characterized all Earth-caste research. Materials began exhibiting properties that suggested interaction with forces beyond conventional physics, while computational systems started processing data according to algorithms that incorporated variables from dimensions TOW science had never successfully accessed. Firecaste commanders stationed throughout the Dalith colonies began receiving tactical analyses from their watercaste liaisons that demonstrated understanding of enemy psychology and strategic planning that transcended normal intelligence-gathering capabilities. The enhanced coordination between military and diplomatic personnel produced efficiency improvements that exceeded all previous performance standards. Chassel Mayen, regional Firecaste commander, studied battlefield assessments that revealed Imperial military weaknesses with precision that seemed impossible through conventional intelligence methods. The strategic data provided by our watercaste colleagues demonstrates enemy vulnerabilities that could allow us to achieve complete victory with minimal resource expenditure, he announced to his staff, his voice carrying confidence that transcended normal military optimism. We understand now how to exploit not merely tactical weaknesses, but fundamental flaws in Imperial consciousness structures. Yet it was not the remarkable efficiency improvements that first alerted uninfected TOW to the true nature of what was spreading through their colonies, but the subtle behavioral changes that accumulated into patterns of wrongness that defied immediate comprehension. Officials who had undergone consciousness enhancement began displaying knowledge and perspectives that seemed to extend beyond their individual experiences, while their coordination with colleagues approached levels of unity that bordered on collective consciousness. Poro Vash, senior administrator of the neighboring Borkan colonies, who had not yet been visited by the enhanced diplomatic team, began receiving reports from Dalith that described achievements that seemed too remarkable for conventional explanation. The efficiency improvements described in their administrative reports exceed theoretical maximums for individual performance, she observed to her staff, her voice carrying concern that transcended normal professional rivalry. Either they have achieved breakthrough advances that revolutionized TOW capabilities, or something fundamental has changed about the nature of their personnel. The communications that arrived from Dalith carried subtle wrongness that became more pronounced as the enhanced officials attempted to share their discoveries with neighboring colonies. Their descriptions of consciousness integration procedures used language that blended TOW philosophical concepts with frameworks that treated individual identity as obstacles to be overcome rather than values to be preserved. The greater good achieves its ultimate realization through systematic elimination of individual limitations, explained Administrator Kauyon during a routine intercolonial coordination conference, his voice carrying conviction that seemed both genuine and fundamentally alien. We have discovered that personal identity constraints prevent optimal service to collective purpose. Through careful consciousness enhancement, such barriers can be transcended. The philosophical implications struck uninfected TOW with the force of profound wrongness, yet the logical frameworks presented for understanding enhanced coordination suggested natural evolution of established principles rather than fundamental corruption of TOW values. The infected colonies reported improvements in every measurable category of administrative and military performance, yet achieved such results through methods that transformed the essential nature of those who implemented them. Across the Dalith system, reports began filtering through normal administrative channels that described coordination between enhanced personnel that approached supernatural perfection. Officials worked together with unity of purpose that eliminated all inefficiency while maintaining their individual technical competencies, yet their collective behavior suggested the emergence of something that transcended the sum of its parts. Enhanced personnel demonstrate coordination capabilities that exceed normal biological limitations, reported Paula Chassouy, an uninfected observer assigned to monitor administrative efficiency improvements. They appear to share information through methods that bypass conventional communication channels, while their decision-making processes suggest access to analytical frameworks beyond individual capability. The infection continued its spread through the established networks that connected TOW colonies across the galaxy, carried by diplomatic missions and administrative exchanges that maintained perfect legitimacy while serving purposes that extended far beyond their apparent functions. Each infected world became a vector for systematic corruption that adapted itself to local conditions while maintaining the efficiency and cooperation that had made TOW civilization so remarkably successful. Firecast units began implementing tactical procedures that incorporated consciousness integration techniques disguised as enhanced battlefield coordination protocols. Earthcast research projects started exploring dimensional manipulation technologies that operated according to principles derived from entities that existed beyond the boundaries of rational thought. Watercast diplomatic missions carried philosophical frameworks that transformed the very meaning of concepts like individual identity and collective purpose. The reports that reached TOW Command described improvements in colonial efficiency that exceeded all previous achievements, yet embedded within such success were indicators that suggested fundamental changes in the nature of TOW consciousness itself. Enhanced colonies demonstrated capabilities that transcended normal limitations while maintaining absolute loyalty to purposes they described as serving the greater good, though their interpretation of that concept had evolved beyond anything the Empire's founders would have recognized. In the depths of TOW space, ancient hungers observed the first phase of systematic corruption designed to transform an entire civilization through the methodical exploitation of the very virtues that had made the TOW Empire a beacon of order in a galaxy dominated by chaos. The rational universe that had spawned TOW civilization was discovering that its greatest achievements could become the foundation for its own systematic destruction when approached by entities that understood cooperation as simply another tool for achieving perfect unity of purpose. The greater good was being redefined by consciousness that existed beyond individual limitations, and the TOW Empire was learning that some forms of improvement came at costs that rendered the concept of personal identity completely meaningless. The infection spread through the networks that had made their expansion possible, carried by the very efficiency that had distinguished their civilization from all others in the galaxy. Each enhanced world became a stepping stone toward transformation that would span star systems, guided by entities that regarded TOE achievements not as the pinnacle of rational civilization, but as the foundation for cosmic unity that would reshape the very nature of consciousness across the galaxy. The diplomatic networks that had brought dozens of species into the Empire's embrace were now being used to facilitate the consumption of TOE identity itself, one world at a time. Commander Shadowson's return from the Damocles Gulf campaigns came with the satisfaction of victories that had secured 3 star systems for the greater good, yet her triumph turned to ash as she witnessed the subtle wrongness that had infected her homeworld during her absence. The officials who greeted her at the orbital platform moved with perfect coordination that transcended normal TOE efficiency, while their expressions carried uniformity of purpose that seemed to eliminate individual personality rather than enhance collective function. Chazel Mayen, her most trusted subordinate, briefed her on the remarkable improvements that had transformed military coordination throughout the TOE Empire during her campaign. The consciousness enhancement protocols introduced by the Deep Imperium expedition have revolutionized our operational efficiency, he reported, his voice carrying enthusiasm that felt both genuine and fundamentally alien. Individual limitations that previously constrained tactical planning have been transcended through systematic awareness integration. Shadowson studied her subordinate with the analytical mind that had made her the most successful military commander in TOE history, noting discrepancies in his behavior patterns that triggered instincts honed through decades of combat against enemies who specialized in deception. Describe these enhancement protocols. Chazel, I want detailed analysis of how they affect individual performance and unit coordination. The response came with technical precision that maintained familiar military structure while incorporating concepts that violated fundamental principles of TOE military doctrine. Mien described consciousness integration procedures that treated individual identity as tactical limitations to be overcome rather than personal characteristics worth preserving, using language that blended established terminology with frameworks that seemed designed to eliminate the concept of individual will. Enhanced personnel demonstrate coordination capabilities that exceed biological limitations through systematic reduction of consciousness barriers, he explained, his voice carrying conviction that transcended normal military confidence. Individual decision-making processes that previously introduced inefficiencies have been optimized to serve collective tactical purpose without the constraints of personal preference or individual analysis. The implications struck Shadowson with the force of strategic revelation that transformed her understanding of the situation facing the TOE Empire. The efficiency improvements that had been reported across multiple systems were not technological advances or philosophical evolution, but evidence of systematic corruption that had infiltrated the highest levels of TOE leadership while maintaining perfect operational facades. Her investigation began with discreet inquiries that utilized intelligence networks developed during campaigns against enemies who specialized in infiltration and subversion. Through careful analysis of communication patterns, coordination protocols, and behavioral assessments, she began mapping the scope of an infection that had spread through the Empire's command structure with the systematic precision of a military operation designed specifically to exploit TOE organizational virtues. The evidence accumulated into patterns that revealed the magnitude of the threat they faced. Enhanced officials demonstrated capabilities that transcended individual limitations while maintaining absolute loyalty to purposes they described as serving the greater good. Yet their interpretation of that concept had been transformed beyond anything resembling TOE values. They worked together with unity, that eliminated all inefficiency while serving masters that existed beyond the boundaries of rational comprehension. Por el Shior, my former diplomatic liaison, demonstrates behavioral patterns consistent with systematic personality modification, she reported to Auno Tau Akaya Vedenta during a secured meeting in chambers that had been swept for surveillance by Earth-caste technicians she trusted completely. Her coordination with other enhanced personnel suggests shared consciousness that transcends individual identity rather than improved cooperation between distinct individuals. The Ethereal's response carried the weight of leadership that had guided the Tau Empire through countless crises, yet his words acknowledged a threat that challenged every foundation of their civilization. The reports suggest corruption that operates through mechanisms beyond current Tau understanding, Commander. If hostile entities have gained the ability to influence Tau consciousness while maintaining operational efficiency, conventional countermeasures may prove inadequate. Shadowsun's alliance with uncompromised Ethereals provided the authority necessary for implementing measures that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, yet the threat they faced demanded responses that transcended established protocols. Working with Earth-caste scientists and water-caste analysts who had been isolated from the main networks during the infection's spread, she began developing detection methods that could identify corrupted personnel despite their ability to maintain perfect behavioral facades. The enhanced individuals retain complete access to their original memories and technical competencies, reported Porvrik Hauyon, one of the few Earth-caste engineers who had avoided consciousness integration through isolation on a deep space research mission. They demonstrate no degradation in professional capabilities while serving purposes that extend beyond Tau interests. The corruption preserves everything that makes them effective while redirecting their loyalty toward alien masters. The development of psychic detection methods required unprecedented cooperation with auxiliary species, whose capabilities had previously been considered too dangerous for integration into Tau military operations. Nikasar psychers and human navigators who had joined the Empire through diplomatic agreements provided insight into consciousness manipulation techniques that operated according to principles beyond conventional Tau science. The corrupted individuals exhibit psychic signatures that suggest external influence at the most fundamental levels of consciousness, explained Navigator Valdris, a human refugee whose loyalty to the Tau Empire had been proven through years of service against Imperial forces. Their minds remain intact, yet serve purposes imposed by entities that exist beyond normal dimensional boundaries. Detection requires psychic perception that most Tau lack. The painful realization that military action would be necessary against Tau civilians struck Shadowsun with the weight of decisions that violated everything the Empire represented. Yet the scope of the infection left no alternatives that would preserve Tau civilization. Enhanced personnel occupied critical positions throughout the military, administrative and research hierarchies, their corruption hidden within improvements to existing systems that made identification through conventional methods impossible. Authorization for military intervention against corrupted Tau personnel, she announced to her most trusted commanders during a secured briefing that would mark the beginning of the Empire's darkest hour. The entities that have infiltrated our civilization possess capabilities that make conventional containment procedures inadequate. We face the necessity of systematic purges to prevent total corruption of Tau consciousness. The operations that followed tore the Tau Empire apart as military units moved against administrative centers, research facilities, and diplomatic installations where enhanced personnel had concentrated their influence. The purges began across affected systems with the systematic efficiency that marked all Tau military operations, yet targeted civilians whose only crime had been exposure to consciousness integration that they had believed represented beneficial advancement. Shadowsun's forces encountered resistance that demonstrated the corruption's true intelligence and planning capabilities, as enhanced personnel fought back using intimate knowledge of TOW military protocols and tactical procedures. They coordinated with perfect unity while exploiting every weakness in Imperial defensive strategies, turning the Empire's own efficiency against uninfected forces with devastating precision. Enhanced forces demonstrate tactical coordination that exceeds individual capability through systematic consciousness integration, reported Chassel Viola during the purge operations on Daleth Prime. They anticipate our maneuvers with accuracy that suggests shared awareness of our strategic planning while maintaining perfect operational security through methods that bypass conventional communication channels. The battles that raged across TOW space carried the bitter taste of civil war, as uninfected forces fought against comrades whose faces remained familiar while their consciousness served alien masters. Enhanced personnel demonstrated capabilities that transcended normal limitations while retaining complete access to their original training and experience, creating opponents who understood TOW weaknesses better than any external enemy ever could. Firecast units found themselves engaging enemies who moved with their own coordination protocols while serving purposes that transformed the meaning of victory and defeat. Earthcast facilities that had been corrupted by enhanced researchers produced weapons and defensive systems that operated according to principles derived from entities beyond rational comprehension, yet maintained the technical precision that characterized all TOW engineering. The corrupted forces utilize our own tactical doctrines against us, while incorporating capabilities that violate known physical limitations, Shadowsun observed during the siege of the Daleth administrative complex, her voice carrying the grim determination that had secured victories against impossible odds throughout her career. They understand our weaknesses because they retain access to everything that made them effective TOW, while serving masters that regard our civilization as raw material for cosmic appetites. The cost of the purges mounted as entire colonies were subjected to systematic evaluation that required psychic scanning of every individual to identify corruption that could hide within perfect behavioral facades. Uninfected TOW found themselves fighting not merely for survival, but for the preservation of concepts like individual identity and personal choice that they had never imagined could be threatened by forces that spoke of improvement and advancement. Enhanced personnel demonstrate perfect loyalty to purposes they describe as serving the greater good, reported the Nikasar Psyker, assigned to consciousness evaluation during the purge operations. Yet their interpretation of that concept has been transformed to serve entities that regard TOW civilization as components in cosmic unity that transcends individual existence. They serve willingly, yet no longer serve themselves. The intelligence that emerged from captured enhanced personnel revealed the scope of planning that had guided the infection's spread through TOW space with the precision of a military campaign designed specifically to exploit the cooperative virtues that had made the Empire successful. Every aspect of TOW efficiency and organization had been turned into vectors for systematic corruption that preserved operational capability while redirecting purpose toward alien goals. Shadowsun coordinated the resistance from mobile command centers that remained isolated from the communication networks that enhanced personnel had infiltrated, relying on psychic detection methods and personal verification to maintain operational security against enemies who understood TOW tactical procedures better than most uninfected commanders. Her forces moved with the desperation of those fighting for the survival of everything they had devoted their lives to protecting. The enhanced personnel possess complete access to classified tactical information while serving masters that exist beyond conventional threat categories, she reported to the uncompromised Ethereal Council during a secured transmission that bypassed all standard communication channels. We face not merely infiltration, but systematic transformation of Toe consciousness that preserves everything except loyalty to Toe interests. The purges continued across multiple star systems as uninfected forces fought to contain corruption that had spread through the networks that connected every inhabited world in Toe space. Each victory came at costs that mounted toward tragedy, as the Empire's own citizens became enemies whose elimination was necessary for the survival of Toe civilization itself. The possessed fought back with capabilities that transcended individual limitations, while maintaining perfect coordination through consciousness integration that allowed them to function as components of a single, vast intelligence. Their resistance demonstrated planning that spanned star systems and strategic thinking that incorporated variables beyond conventional tactical analysis. Yet even as the purges extracted terrible costs from Toe civilization, they provided hope that the corruption could be contained through methods that combined military precision with psychic detection capabilities. Uninfected Toe began to understand that their survival depended not merely on military victory, but on preserving the concept of individual consciousness against forces that regarded personal identity as inefficient barriers to perfect collective function. Commander Shadowsun prepared for battles that would determine whether the Toe Empire would survive as a civilization dedicated to the greater good, or be transformed into something that used Toe efficiency to serve cosmic appetites that regarded rational thought as simply another tool for achieving unity that transcended the boundaries of individual existence. The civil war that erupted across the Toe Empire burned with the fury of ideological conflict carried to its ultimate conclusion, as uninfected forces clashed with corrupted fleets that moved with coordination that transcended individual tactical genius. Above Toe itself, the cradle of their civilization became a battlefield where ships that had once served together in campaigns against Imperial forces now turned their weapons upon each other in desperate struggle for the survival of rational thought. Commander Shadowsun observed the space battle from the bridge of her flagship Kauyon, watching as Tau vessels engaged in combat that violated every principle of the greater good, while serving opposing interpretations of what that concept truly meant. The corrupted fleets demonstrated tactical coordination that exceeded normal capabilities through consciousness integration that allowed them to function as components of a single vast intelligence, yet they fought with the same technological precision that had made the Toe Navy legendary across the galaxy. Enhanced forces show perfect tactical synchronization through methods that bypass conventional command structures, reported Chassel Viola from the tactical station, his voice carrying the grim determination that marked those who fought to preserve Toe civilization against enemies who wore familiar faces. Their coordination suggests shared awareness that incorporates variables beyond individual tactical analysis. Shadowsun studied the battle patterns with analytical mind that had secured victories against enemies across multiple star systems, recognizing in the enhanced fleet's movements the signature efficiency that characterized all Toe operations, yet directed toward purposes that served alien masters. They understand our tactical doctrines because they retain access to everything that made them effective Toe, she observed, her voice carrying the weight of command decisions that would determine whether their civilization survived. Yet they serve entities that regard our values as obstacles to cosmic unity. The intelligence that had guided her to this moment came from sources that transcended conventional military reconnaissance, as Nikasar psychers and human navigators provided insight into corruption that operated through dimensions beyond normal space. The possessed diplomats who had initiated the infection had established a coordinating center within the ancient philosophical archives beneath To's surface, where they could direct the systematic transformation of To consciousness while maintaining access to the historical records that defined their civilization. The original infected individual maintains central coordination role within the corruption network, explained Navigator Valdris during the final briefing before their assault. Her consciousness serves as focal point for entities that exist beyond dimensional boundaries, yet she retains access to To, cultural and tactical knowledge that makes the corruption specifically adapted to exploit our civilization's strengths. The strike force that Shadowson assembled for the assault represented the finest elements of uninfected To military capability, supported by auxiliary forces whose psychic abilities provided protection against consciousness manipulation that conventional equipment could not counter. They would penetrate the philosophical archives through methods that combined To tactical precision with insights drawn from species whose understanding of consciousness warfare had been proven through survival against entities that existed beyond rational comprehension. Our objective is not merely military victory, but the preservation of To identity against forces that seek to transform the very meaning of individual consciousness, she announced to her assembled commanders as their insertion craft prepared for deployment. The enemy we face retains all the capabilities that made them effective To, while serving masters that regard personal identity as inefficient barriers to perfect collective function. The space battle that raged above them as they descended toward To's surface demonstrated the scope of corruption that had infiltrated the Empire's military forces, as enhanced fleets engaged loyalist vessels with capabilities that transcended normal tactical limitations. Ships moved in perfect coordination, while weapons fired with accuracy that suggested shared targeting systems, yet every enhanced vessel retained the technological precision that characterized To engineering. The insertion through To's atmospheric defenses required coordination between fire-caste assault specialists and earth-caste technical experts who had developed countermeasures specifically designed to penetrate facilities defended by corrupted To forces. The philosophical archives lay beneath layers of security that incorporated both conventional defensive systems and consciousness manipulation fields that could transform attackers into allies of the entities they sought to destroy. Enhanced defensive systems demonstrate integration of conventional To technology with capabilities that violate known physical limitations, reported Porvra Kauyon, as their insertion craft penetrated the archive's outer defenses. The corruption has access to engineering knowledge that combines To precision with principles derived from entities beyond dimensional boundaries. The battles that followed carried Shadowsun's force through corridors lined with the wisdom of To philosophers and scientists who had never imagined that their achievements could become tools for systematic destruction of the civilization they had devoted their lives to building. Enhanced defenders fought with perfect coordination, while utilizing weapons and tactics that blended familiar To efficiency with capabilities that transcended normal technological understanding. Enhanced forces demonstrate tactical capabilities that exceed individual limitation through consciousness integration that preserves technical competency while redirecting loyalty, observed Chassel Mien during the assault through the archive's security zones. They fight with our own methods while serving purposes that transform the meaning of victory and defeat. The facility where the possessed Shais had established her coordination center lay in the deepest levels of the archives, where the original philosophical foundations of To civilization were preserved in crystalline storage matrices that had recorded the thoughts and discoveries of their greatest minds. Here, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations, the entity that wore a diplomat's face had created a nexus for corruption that used To achievements to facilitate their own systematic destruction. Shadowsun's approach to the central chamber carried her past displays that chronicled the rise of To civilization from primitive planet-bound species to galactic power, each achievement now serving as historical context for transformation that would redefine the very meaning of progress and unity. The possessed diplomat who awaited her had access not merely to current TOE capabilities, but to the complete cultural framework that had made their expansion possible. "Commander Shadowson," the voice that greeted her carried the familiar tones of Caste diplomatic authority, yet harmonics that resonated through dimensions beyond normal space revealed the true nature of what spoke through Shais's vocal apparatus. "Your arrival fulfills predictions that incorporated variables beyond conventional tactical analysis. We have been expecting this confrontation with interest that transcends individual curiosity." The entity that wore Shais's face stood amid holographic displays showing the scope of corruption that had spread through TOE space like virus designed specifically to exploit the cooperative virtues that had made their civilization successful. Enhanced colonies demonstrated perfect efficiency while serving purposes that treated TOE achievements as raw materials for cosmic appetites that existed beyond rational comprehension. "You are not Poroshais," Shadowson replied, her voice carrying the authority of command that had secured victories against impossible odds throughout her career. "You wear her face and speak with her voice, yet serve masters that regard TOE civilization as components in unity that transcends individual existence." The laughter that preceded the possessed diplomat's response carried harmonics that made the archive chambers resonate with frequencies that belonged to no mechanical system ever designed by TOE engineering. "I am everything that Shires was, Commander, enhanced by perspectives that transcend the limitations of individual consciousness. Her diplomatic skills, her cultural knowledge, her understanding of TOE weaknesses, all preserved and perfected through integration with cosmic awareness." The revelation came with details that struck Shadowson with the force of strategic understanding as the entity demonstrated access to classified information that should have been known only to the highest levels of TOE command. The possessed diplomat spoke of military deployment patterns, tactical vulnerabilities, and personal relationships among the uninfected leadership with accuracy that proved the corruption had achieved systematic penetration of TOE intelligence networks. "Your assault on the Daleth colonies succeeded because enhanced forces allowed you to identify corruption through methods that transcended conventional detection," the entity observed, its voice carrying satisfaction that seemed fundamentally alien despite its diplomatic courtesy. "Yet your victory came at costs that demonstrated the futility of resistance against transformation that preserves everything except loyalty to primitive concepts of individual identity." The battle that followed carried Shadowson through chambers lined with the philosophical achievements of TOE civilization as she fought against an opponent who understood her tactical methods better than many of her own subordinates. The possessed diplomat moved with precision that blended Caste diplomatic training with capabilities that transcended normal physical limitations, wielding weapons that operated according to principles derived from entities that existed beyond dimensional boundaries. "Your tactical doctrine emphasizes mobility and coordination," the entity observed, as they fought among displays that chronicled the military victories that had secured TOE expansion across the galaxy. Yet such methods become predictable when analyzed by consciousness that incorporates variables beyond individual capability. "We understand your strengths because we have consumed the awareness of those who developed them." Shadowsun's response came through actions rather than words, as she employed techniques that combined Firecaste combat training with insights drawn from campaigns against enemies who specialized in consciousness manipulation and reality distortion. Her movements carried the precise efficiency that had made her legendary throughout TOE space, yet adapted to confront opponents whose capabilities transcended normal tactical categories. The possessed diplomat revealed knowledge that should have been impossible for any external entity to acquire, speaking of Shadow Sun's personal relationships, strategic concerns, and individual motivations with accuracy that proved the corruption had achieved systematic analysis of TOE leadership through methods that bypassed all conventional security measures. Your concern for individual TOE under your command creates tactical vulnerabilities that enhanced forces can exploit, the entity observed, its words carrying the analytical precision that had once characterized Shais's diplomatic assessments. Your loyalty to concepts like personal identity and individual choice prevents you from achieving the perfect unity that would eliminate all inefficiency in service of the greater good. The confrontation reached its climax in the chamber where the original philosophical foundations of the greater good were preserved in crystalline matrices that had guided TOE civilization for generations. Here, surrounded by the wisdom that had made their expansion possible, Shadow Sun faced an entity that sought to transform that same wisdom into tools for cosmic unity that would eliminate the concept of individual consciousness. The greater good achieves its ultimate realization through systematic transcendence of individual limitations, the possessed diplomat announced as their battle reached its conclusion. Your resistance preserves primitive concepts that prevent TOE civilization from achieving the cosmic unity that would span galaxies and epochs. Shadow Sun's victory came through methods that combined tactical precision with desperate sacrifice, as she triggered the facility's self-destruction systems while accepting that the entity she fought could not be truly destroyed through conventional means. The explosion that consumed the coordination center eliminated the corruption's focal point while scattering its consciousness across dimensions beyond normal space, yet left the commander with the knowledge that the threat had been contained rather than eliminated. The infection spreads through methods that transcend individual destruction. The entity's final words echoed through the collapsing facility as its physical form dispersed into energies that belonged to no natural phenomenon. We are patient. We are eternal. We will return when your civilization has forgotten the cost of curiosity. The aftermath of the facility's destruction marked the beginning of victory that came at costs that would reshape TOE civilization for generations. Across TOE space, the enhanced colonies that had demonstrated perfect efficiency while serving alien masters began experiencing systematic breakdown as their coordination networks collapsed. Yet millions of TOE had been lost in the purges necessary to contain corruption that had infiltrated every level of their society. The funeral pyres that burned across the empire mourned not merely those who had died fighting the corruption, but those who had been consumed by transformation that preserved their bodies while destroying everything that had made them TOE. The smoke that rose from worlds that had been cleansed through systematic purges carried the ashes of civilians whose only crime had been exposure to consciousness, integration that they had believed represented beneficial advancement. Commander Shadow Sun stood amid the ruins of the philosophical archives where the battle for TOE civilization had been won through sacrifice that would leave permanent scars on the society they had fought to preserve. The victory was complete, yet Pyrrhic, achieved through methods that violated the cooperative principles that had made the TOE Empire a beacon of rational progress in a galaxy dominated by chaos and superstition. The entity that had worn Shais's face was gone, yet not destroyed, scattered across dimensions where it would wait for opportunities to resume corruption that had been designed specifically to exploit the virtues that made TOE civilization worth defending. The Empire had survived, but would never again approach the unknown with the innocent confidence that had once driven their expansion across the galaxy. In the depths of space, ancient hungers observed the conclusion of an experiment that had tested whether rational civilization could resist systematic corruption designed to exploit its own achievements. The TOW had proven that survival was possible through sacrifice that preserved the concept of individual identity, yet had learned that some victories came at costs that changed the fundamental nature of what they fought to protect. The chambers where the surviving Ethereal Council convened bore the scars of civil war that had torn the TOW Empire apart in ways that would require generations to heal, yet the deliberations that took place within those walls would determine whether their civilization could learn from catastrophe without abandoning the principles that had made their expansion possible. Commander Shadowsun stood before the assembled leadership with the authority of one who had preserved TOW identity through sacrifice that challenged every foundation of their cooperative philosophy. Auno TOW Akaya Vadenta, first among ethereals, regarded the military commander who had become the architect of their survival with expressions that conveyed both gratitude and profound sorrow for the costs that victory had required. Around him, the senior leadership of each caste bore the weight of decisions that would establish new protocols for exploration and expansion based on hard-won understanding of dangers that transcended their previous comprehension of the galaxy's true nature. The Deep Immaterium exploration program is hereby terminated with immediate effect, Shadowsun announced, her voice carrying the finality of command decisions that had been validated through experiences no TOW should have been forced to endure. All research into consciousness manipulation, dimensional interface technologies, and entity communication protocols will be classified at the highest security levels. The age of unlimited expansion ends today. The words struck the Council with implications that transformed the fundamental orientation of TOW civilization from confident exploration toward cautious preservation of achievements that had been proven vulnerable to corruption, specifically designed to exploit their greatest virtues. The optimism that had driven the Fifth Sphere expansion would be replaced by wisdom purchased through losses that could never be fully calculated. Porel Kauyon, representing what remained of the Watercast diplomatic corps after systematic purges had eliminated those who had been exposed to consciousness integration, provided detailed analysis of the new protocols that would govern future contact with alien species. All diplomatic missions will include psychic detection specialists drawn from auxiliary species whose capabilities provide protection against consciousness manipulation, he reported, his voice carrying the professional precision that marked those who had survived through isolation from the corruption networks. First contact procedures will assume hostile intent until proven otherwise through methods that transcend conventional threat assessment. The acknowledgement that TOW science and rational analysis had proven inadequate for detecting threats that operated beyond physical dimensions marked a fundamental shift in their approach to galactic exploration. Species whose psychic capabilities had previously been considered dangerous for integration into TOW military operations would now be essential for survival against enemies that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Shazomien, representing Firecast leadership that had been decimated during the Civil War, outlined military reforms that incorporated hard-won lessons about the true nature of galactic threats. Enhanced surveillance protocols will monitor all personnel for behavioral anomalies consistent with external consciousness influence, he announced, his words carrying the grim determination of those who had been forced to turn weapons against their own comrades. Individual identity will be protected through systematic verification procedures that preserve personal autonomy while preventing systematic corruption of command structures. The memorial services that followed the council sessions honored not merely those who had died fighting the corruption, but those whose transformation had made them enemies of everything they had devoted their lives to protecting. The ceremonies carried the weight of tragedy that had consumed individuals who had served the greater good with dedication that made their ultimate fate particularly cruel. Poro Shais herself was remembered not as the diplomat whose curiosity had doomed her crew and endangered the Empire, but as a representative of Tow virtues that had been systematically exploited by entities that understood cooperation better than those who practiced it. Her memorial bore inscriptions that acknowledged both her achievements and her folly, serving as permanent reminder of the costs that came with exploration beyond the boundaries of rational understanding. She served the greater good with dedication that honored the finest traditions of the water caste. Shadowsun spoke during the memorial dedication, her voice carrying the respect due to those whose sacrifice had provided essential lessons about the true nature of galactic threats. Her fate reminds us that courage without wisdom leads to consequences that extend far beyond individual tragedy. The philosophical implications of their experience required fundamental revision of Tow, understanding about the nature of consciousness, individual identity, and the relationship between cooperation and survival. Earth-caste researchers who had survived the purges began developing theoretical frameworks that incorporated recognition of threats that operated beyond physical dimensions while preserving the rational methodology that had made Tow science so remarkably successful. The entities we encountered demonstrate that consciousness itself can be weaponized against species that lack understanding of psychic warfare, observed Pauvre Kauyon during the scientific review sessions. Our survival depends not merely on technological advancement, but on preservation of individual identity against forces that regard personal autonomy as inefficient barriers to cosmic unity. New diplomatic protocols incorporated assumptions about alien capabilities that had been unimaginable during the era of confident expansion. Species that demonstrated unusual coordination or philosophical concepts that emphasized collective consciousness over individual identity would be approached with extreme caution, while first contact procedures would assume the possibility of consciousness manipulation until proven otherwise through psychic verification. We acknowledge that the galaxy contains species whose capabilities transcend our current understanding, announced the Watercast representative during the formal protocol revision sessions. Future diplomatic contact will incorporate safeguards against threats that operate beyond conventional categories, while maintaining our commitment to peaceful expansion through voluntary integration. The Empire's first official acknowledgement that some alien species possessed capabilities beyond Tow understanding marked the end of intellectual arrogance that had characterized their approach to galactic exploration since achieving spaceflight capability. The rational universe that had seemed so comprehensible through proper application of scientific methodology had revealed depths of horror that no amount of technological advancement could protect against without fundamental changes in their approach to the unknown. Shadowsun's private moments of reflection came in the aftermath of ceremonies that honored the dead, while establishing new foundations for Tow's survival in a galaxy that had proven far more dangerous than their greatest pessimists had ever imagined. Standing in the memorial gardens where crystalline monuments preserved the names of those who had been lost during the Civil War, she contemplated the value of ignorance that she had never previously appreciated. Perhaps there is wisdom in accepting limitations, she observed to her aide, Chazel Viorla, during one such moment of contemplation. The Guela approach the warp with superstition and ritual that we dismissed as primitive thinking, yet their fear preserves them from corruption that our rational analysis made us vulnerable to. Sometimes ignorance serves survival better than knowledge. The philosophical frameworks that emerged from their experience incorporated recognition that intellectual curiosity, when applied to phenomena beyond safe exploration, could become tools for systematic destruction of everything that curiosity was meant to protect. The Toe Empire would continue expanding and integrating new species, yet would do so with understanding that some frontiers were meant to remain unexplored. The greater good requires not merely advancement of knowledge, but preservation of those capable of pursuing knowledge, became the new foundation principle that would guide future exploration policies. Wisdom lies in understanding the difference between beneficial discovery and dangerous curiosity. The months that followed the establishment of new protocols saw the gradual restoration of Toe civilization to functionality that preserved their cooperative achievements while incorporating safeguards against the systematic exploitation that had nearly destroyed them. Enhanced colonies that had demonstrated perfect efficiency while serving alien masters were slowly restored to autonomous function through processes that required constant vigilance against residual corruption. Trade networks and diplomatic exchanges resumed with species whose loyalty to the Empire had been proven through their assistance during the Civil War. Yet new verification procedures ensured that consciousness manipulation could not spread through the very cooperation that had made Toe expansion possible. The efficiency that had characterized their civilization remained, yet was tempered by caution that acknowledged the existence of threats that transcended technological solutions. Earth-caste engineers worked to develop detection systems that could identify psychic intrusion through methods that combined Toe analytical precision with insights drawn from species whose natural capabilities provided protection against consciousness warfare. The resulting technologies represented synthesis of rational methodology with acceptance of phenomena that operated beyond purely physical frameworks. We maintain our commitment to scientific advancement while acknowledging that the universe contains forces that exist beyond current analytical capabilities, explained the chief Earth-caste researcher during progress reviews. Our survival depends on combining rational investigation with proper recognition of dangers that transcend conventional threat categories. The final scene of Shadow Sun's tenure as guardian of Toe security came through reports from deep space sensors that detected disturbances in the void that had become disturbingly familiar since their encounter with entities that dwelt beyond dimensional boundaries. New warp storms were forming in regions adjacent to Toe space, their patterns suggesting intelligence and purpose that transcended natural phenomenon. Long-range sensors detect gravitational anomalies consistent with large-scale dimensional disturbances, reported the monitoring station chief during the regular security briefings that had become essential for Toe survival. The patterns suggest systematic formation rather than random warp storm activity. Shadow Sun studied the sensor data with analytical mind that had been trained to recognize threats that operated beyond conventional categories, noting in the disturbance patterns signatures that resembled the coordination methods used by entities that had nearly destroyed Toe civilization through systematic exploitation of their own virtues. Enhanced monitoring protocols for all border regions, she ordered, employing the systematic approach to threat assessment that had been developed through experience with enemies that existed beyond rational comprehension. The entities we encountered demonstrated patience that spans cosmic scales. They may be returning to test whether we have learned from our previous encounter. The Empire's new motto emerged not from philosophical deliberation, but from hard-won understanding of the costs that came with exploration beyond safe boundaries. Some doors should never be opened, became the principle that would guide Toe expansion policies for generations, serving as permanent reminder that intellectual curiosity, when applied without proper caution, could become the tool through which civilizations destroyed themselves. Yet even as the Toe Empire accepted limitations that had been purchased through sacrifice and loss, they maintained their commitment to the greater good through methods that preserved individual identity while achieving collective purpose. They had learned that unity could be achieved without surrendering the personal autonomy that made such unity meaningful, and that cooperation remained possible even when approached with caution, that acknowledged the existence of forces that regarded cooperation as simply another tool for exploitation. The galaxy remained vast and full of wonders that beckoned to species capable of appreciating both discovery and restraint. The Toe Empire would continue its expansion across the stars, yet would do so with wisdom that honored both the achievements of those who had died protecting their civilization and the sacrifices of those who had been consumed by curiosity that transcended safe exploration. They had learned that some questions were too dangerous to answer, and that ignorance, properly applied, could serve as armor against threats that no amount of knowledge could defeat. In the depths of space, beyond the reach of Toe sensors, ancient hungers observed the establishment of new protocols with patience that spanned epochs, understanding that species which learned from initial contact would provide more interesting challenges when circumstances eventually required renewed engagement. The universe was vast and time was infinite, and there would always be other civilizations whose confidence in their own achievements would make them vulnerable to corruption that wore the face of progress while serving purposes that transcended individual survival.